The rain came down in sheets the day Elaine Hutchinson first laid eyes on her inheritance, turning the gravel driveway into a river of mud and memory. She sat in her aging Subaru, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle, staring at the cabin that had haunted her dreams for 25 years. The A-frame structure rose from the pines like something out of time, its faded blue paint the exact shade of forgetting, its weathered boards holding stories she'd spent half a lifetime trying to bury. 52 years old, and she had nothing. No husband, no home of her own, no identity beyond the roles she'd played for others. David's wife for 28 years, until he decided a paralegal 15 years younger was a better investment. Sophie and Ben's mother, though her children were grown now, living their own lives in cities that felt impossibly far away. Rose's granddaughter, though she'd barely spoken to the old woman in the years before her death. Too busy being the perfect suburban wife to remember where she came from. The letter from the estate attorney had arrived 3 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized. Rose Hutchinson, age 94, passed peacefully in her sleep. The cabin at Clearwater Lake, along with all furnishings and property therein, left to her only granddaughter. A separate envelope contained a handwritten note in Rose's spidery script. "You need this place more than you know. Come find yourself again, sweetheart." Elaine had cried for an hour in the parking lot of the lawyer's office, great heaving sobs that embarrassed her even in solitude. She hadn't known Rose had been paying attention. Hadn't known the old woman saw through the Christmas cards with their staged family photos and cheerful lies. Hadn't known someone, anyone, thought she was worth saving. The rain eased to a drizzle. Elaine turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of water dripping from cedar branches and the distant call of a loon on the lake. April in the Pacific Northwest meant mud season, that liminal space between winter's death and spring's resurrection. Everything smelled of wet earth and new growth, of endings and beginnings happening simultaneously. She stepped out of the car and her feet sank 2 inches into the driveway. Great. Her practical flats were immediately soaked, cold water seeping through worn leather. She'd dressed like she was going to the grocery store, not claiming an inheritance. Jeans that had fit better 20 pounds ago, a fleece jacket from some corporate retreat David's firm had hosted a decade back. Her graying hair pulled into a ponytail that had started neat, but now hung limp and defeated. The cabin waited, patient as stone. 3 steps up to a screened porch where Rose used to sit on summer evenings, painting watercolors of the lake. The front door was the same forest green it had always been, though the paint was peeling now, curling away from the wood like skin after a sunburn. Elaine found the key where the attorney said it would be, under a fake rock by the propane tank that fooled absolutely no one. The lock turned with a click that sounded like a door opening inside her chest. Inside, the air was thick with absence and memory. Dust sheets covered the furniture, white ghosts in the dim light filtering through uncleaned windows. The smell hit her first, cedar and must and something indefinable that was pure rose. Maybe it was the lavender sachets the old woman kept in every drawer, or the particular scent of oil paints and turpentine that had always clung to her clothes. Whatever it was, it transported Elaine backward through time with the force of a physical blow. She was 8 years old again, standing in this exact spot, her mother and Rose arguing in terse whispers about something adult and incomprehensible. She was 12, learning to make coffee on the ancient percolator, Rose teaching her the proper way to measure grounds. She was 16, heartbroken over some boy whose name she couldn't even remember now, and Rose was saying nothing, just letting her cry while they painted side by side on the porch. The cabin was smaller than memory had made it. One large room downstairs that served as kitchen, living room, and dining area. A sleeping loft accessible by a ladder that her knees already protested climbing. A bathroom that had been added in the 70s, barely big enough to turn around in. The screened porch where Rose had spent most of her time, where her easel still stood, empty now, waiting for hands that would never return. Elaine pulled the dust sheet off the sofa and sat down hard, springs protesting. Through the window, she could see the dock extending into the lake, gray water rippling in the wind. The dock where she'd learned to fish, where she'd first kissed a boy, where she'd sat the summer after college and told Rose she was marrying David. Rose had been quiet that day, had simply nodded and said, Make sure you know who you are before you become someone's wife. Elaine hadn't understood the warning. She did now. A knock on the door made her jump, heart hammering. She'd been so lost in the past, she'd forgotten the present existed. Through the window, she saw a woman in her 70s standing on the porch, holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, silver hair cut in a practical bob, wearing jeans and a raincoat that had seen better days, smiling with the kind of warmth that reached her eyes. Elaine opened the door, and the woman's smile widened. "You must be Lainey. I'm Diane Porter from next door. Your grandmother was my dearest friend. I'm so very sorry for your loss." The kindness in her voice cracked something in Elaine's carefully maintained composure. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. Diane seemed to understand, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, setting the casserole on the kitchen counter like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Chicken and rice, nothing fancy. Rose always said my cooking was pedestrian but filling." Diane looked around the cabin with the familiarity of decades. "I've been keeping an eye on the place since she passed, making sure the pipes didn't freeze, that sort of thing. Though I have to warn you, the hot water heater is original to the Nixon administration and temperamental as hell." Elaine found her voice, rough from disuse. "Thank you for watching over it, for the food, for everything." Diane waved her hand dismissively. "Rose would have done the same for me. Actually, she did when my husband passed 5 years back. Brought me dinner every night for a month until I told her to stop, that I was getting fat." She turned to face Elaine directly, her expression softening. "She talked about you often, you know, especially toward the end. Said she worried about you, said you'd forgotten how to be yourself." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through Elaine's entire being. She had forgotten, had spent so many years being Mrs. David Chen, being Sophie and Ben's mom, being the perfect committee volunteer and dinner party hostess, that she'd erased whoever Lainey Hutchinson had been. That girl who loved to paint, who could identify every bird by its call, who dreamed of studying art in Paris. That girl had disappeared so gradually, Elaine hadn't even noticed she was gone. "I don't know if I can find her again," Elaine whispered. Diane's smile was sad and knowing. "That's why Rose left you this place. It's good for finding things you've lost, including yourself." She stayed for another 20 minutes, filling the silence with gentle chatter about the neighborhood, the other residents on the lake, the changes that had happened in the years since Elaine had last visited. There was a new HOA president, Victoria something, who Diane described with careful neutrality that suggested volumes. The lake was busier now, more expensive homes replacing the old fishing cabins. But the core community, the old-timers, they were still here, still looking out for each other. Before she left, Diane paused at the door. "There's a women's gathering tomorrow night at the community center. Just a potluck, nothing formal. You should come." Rose never missed one. Elaine made a non-committal sound that could have been agreement or evasion. Diane nodded like she understood perfectly and disappeared into the drizzle, leaving Elaine alone with her ghosts. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unpacking and remembering. She brought in her suitcases, the sum total of her possessions after the divorce. David had kept the house, the furniture, the life they'd built together. She'd walked away with her clothes, a few books, and a settlement that would last maybe 2 years if she was careful. At the time, she'd been too exhausted to fight. Now she wondered if she'd given up too easily, if that had been the pattern all along. Giving up, giving in, making herself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. Night fell early this far north in April. Elaine lit the propane heater, grateful when it coughed to life on the 3rd try, and made herself eat some of Diane's casserole standing over the sink. Through the window, she could see lights from other cabins around the lake, small beacons of human presence in the darkness. She felt utterly alone, and strangely at peace with it. She found Rose's bedroom upstairs in the loft, a space barely large enough for the double bed and small dresser. The bed was made with Rose's signature precision, hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. Elaine stripped the old sheets and remade it with linen she'd brought from the city, but the mattress still smelled like rose, lavender, and thyme. Sleep came fitfully, full of dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking. When dawn broke, pale and watery through the window, Elaine felt like she'd been running all night. Her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with the unfamiliar bed. The morning brought coffee made in Rose's percolator, and the discovery that the cabin's Wi-Fi password was written on a sticky note stuck to the refrigerator. Rose had apparently modernized more than Elaine expected. She checked her email and immediately regretted it. 3 messages from David's attorney about finalizing paperwork, 2 from Sophie, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. The concern evident even through text. 1 from Ben, shorter but no less worried. She responded to her children with reassurances she didn't feel, and ignored the attorney entirely. There was a limit to how much of the past she could handle in one morning. Instead, she explored. In the light of day, the cabin revealed its age and wear: water stains on the ceiling, windows that rattled in their frames, floorboards that creaked with every step. But there was beauty in the decay. The way morning light fell through the trees and painted stripes across the floor. The view of the lake from every window. Water that changed color with the shifting clouds. The sense of being held by something larger than herself. Something that had existed long before her problems and would continue long after. She was standing on the dock, coffee in hand, watching a blue heron fish in the shallows when she heard the sound of expensive shoes on weathered wood. Click, 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 the rhythm of someone who wanted to be heard. The woman approaching was everything Elaine wasn't. Mid-50s, but fighting it with the kind of maintenance that required serious money. Blonde hair in a perfect bob. Designer athleisure wear that probably cost more than Elaine's car payment. Carrying a clipboard like a shield and a weapon simultaneously. Her smile was wide and showed too many teeth. Mrs. Hutchinson? I'm Victoria Whitmore, president of the Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association. Welcome to the community. The words were warm, but the tone was assessment, cataloging every detail of Elaine's appearance and finding it wanting. I wanted to stop by and make sure you're aware of our community standards and regulations. Elaine blinked, thrown by the sudden shift from solitary peace to social performance. Community standards? Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes went sharp. Yes, we maintain certain aesthetic requirements to preserve property values. I noticed your lawn is quite overgrown. Our standard is 2 inches maximum height. You'll want to address that within the next week. The lawn. Elaine hadn't even thought about the lawn. She glanced back at the cabin, at the yard that had indeed grown wild, and felt something tight form in her chest. I just arrived yesterday. I'm still settling in. Of course. Victoria made a note on her clipboard. I understand you're in transition, but we do have rules for a reason. The community has invested significantly in maintaining a certain standard here at Clearwater Lake. I'm sure you want to be a good neighbor. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Elaine felt herself shrinking, felt the old impulse to apologize, to accommodate, to make herself smaller so the stranger would be comfortable. The words were already forming. I'm so sorry. I'll take care of it right away. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. But something stopped her. Maybe it was standing on Rose's dock. Or maybe it was the memory of Diane's words about forgetting herself. Instead, she heard herself say, I'll look into it. Victoria's smile froze for just a moment. I appreciate that. I'll be sending you a complete copy of our regulations. There are also matters regarding your dock. We've had some concerns about structural integrity and whether it meets current safety standards. This dock has been here since 1964, Elaine said, surprise in her own voice at the edge she heard there. Exactly. Victoria's tone suggested this proved her point. Standards have evolved. We'll need to discuss bringing everything into compliance, but we can address that later. Welcome again, Mrs. Hutchinson. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other. She clicked away, leaving Elaine standing on the dock with her coffee gone cold and a feeling in her gut like she'd just been evaluated and found lacking. The peace of the morning had evaporated, replaced by anxiety that felt familiar as her own heartbeat. The fear of not measuring up, of being wrong, of causing trouble just by existing. Back in the cabin, Elaine found herself looking at the space through Victoria's eyes. The peeling paint, the ancient appliances, the general air of benign neglect. Rose had never cared about keeping up with the neighbors. She'd lived her life on her own terms, painted her paintings, fished from her dock, and ignored anyone who thought she should be different. Elaine wanted desperately to be Rose. Instead, she was herself. Uncertain, anxious, already planning how to mow a lawn she didn't have equipment to mow. The knock on the door an hour later made her jump again. She was starting to feel like a nervous animal, startled by every sound. But this time it was a different woman. Younger, maybe early 40s, wearing work clothes and a tool belt. Her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The woman stuck out her hand. "Emma Chen. I do electrical work around the lake. Your grandmother hired me to update some wiring last year. Diane mentioned you'd arrived and might need help with a few things." Elaine shook her hand, noticing the firm grip, the calluses that spoke of real work. The shared surname registered. Chen, like my ex-husband. Emma smiled. "Half the world is Chen. But yeah, Chinese-American, if that's what you're asking. My family's been in Oregon since the railroad days." She glanced past Elaine into the cabin. "Mind if I check the work I did? Make sure everything's still running right?" "Please." Elaine stepped aside, grateful for the company, for someone who didn't seem to be judging her or the cabin's condition. Emma moved through the space with the confidence of familiarity, checking outlets, flipping breakers, making small talk about the lake and the community. She had a daughter, Zoe, 14, and giving her hell. She'd been divorced 3 years and was still figuring out how to be a single mom and run her own business. Her words were easy, unguarded in a way that made Elaine feel less alone in her own uncertainty. "Everything looks good," Emma said finally, closing the breaker box. Rose was smart to upgrade when she did. This old wiring was a fire hazard waiting to happen. She hesitated, then added, "I heard you met Victoria. News travels fast. Small community." Emma's expression was carefully neutral. "She's particular about how things look. A lot of the old-timers, we just ignore her. But she can make life difficult if she decides you're a problem." "Am I a problem?" The question came out smaller than Elaine intended. Emma looked at her directly, something fierce and kind in her eyes. "You're a woman living alone in a cabin that doesn't fit Victoria's vision of what this lake should be. That makes you a problem in her book. But here's what I learned. You can spend your whole life trying to fit someone else's vision, or you can live your own life." Rose chose the second option. Made Victoria crazy, but Rose didn't care. "I'm not Rose," Elaine said quietly. "Not yet, but you could be." Emma shouldered her tool bag. "If you need anything, electrical or otherwise, I'm in the book. And Lainey, don't let Victoria make you feel small. You've got as much right to be here as anyone." After Emma left, Elaine stood in the center of the cabin and felt the weight of expectations pressing down from all sides. Victoria's standards, her children's worry, David's judgment even in absence, and underneath it all, Rose's ghost asking a question she couldn't quite hear. She spent the afternoon going through Rose's things, a task she'd been avoiding. The dresser held clothes that still smelled of lavender. The kitchen cabinets contained mismatched dishes and a collection of coffee mugs from places Rose had traveled. The closet in the loft revealed boxes of art supplies, canvases finished and unfinished, a lifetime of creation preserved in oil and watercolor. At the back of the closet, hidden under a pile of old blankets, Elaine found something that made her breath catch. A wooden box, about the size of a shoebox with a small brass lock. She knew this box, had seen it as a child, had asked Rose what was inside. Rose had smiled and said, "Things worth keeping safe." The key wasn't with the box, but Elaine remembered Rose's habits. She checked the obvious places first, taped under a drawer, hidden in a coffee can, tucked into a book. Nothing. Then she remembered Rose's watercolor box, the battered metal case that held her paints and brushes. She found it on the screened porch where it had always lived, untouched since Rose's last painting session. Inside, nestled among tubes of paint, was a small brass key. Her hands shook as she fitted it into the lock. The box opened with a click that sounded like a secret being told. Inside, she found a sealed envelope with her name written in Rose's handwriting, a photograph of Rose and a man Elaine vaguely recognized as her grandfather Henry, both young and standing with a surveyor next to a plot of raw land, and underneath, a folded document that looked official and old. Elaine unfolded it carefully. It was a survey map, dated 1964, showing the lake and surrounding properties. Hand-drawn lines marked boundaries, and there in Rose and Henry's handwriting were notations she didn't understand. Water rights retained, riparian access in perpetuity, subsurface mineral rights. The envelope seemed to pulse in her hands. She broke the seal and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in Rose's writing. Dearest Lainey, if you're reading this, someone is trying to take what belongs to you. Don't let them. This land, this lake, they hold more than you know. Your grandfather and I bought this property when you could still own something outright, before regulations and associations and people like Victoria Whitmore decided they knew better than everyone else. We kept certain rights, important rights. The lake isn't just water and fish and pretty sunsets. It's power, it's leverage, it's freedom. The documents in the safe deposit box at First Mountain Bank will prove everything. The key is taped inside my watercolor box, behind the lid lining. Trust the land, Lainey. It won't fail you the way people do. And trust yourself. You're stronger than you think. You're my granddaughter. Act like it. With all my love, Rose. Elaine read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each reading. Safe deposit box. Water rights. Power and leverage and freedom. What had Rose been planning? What had she known? The survey map showed boundaries that didn't match what Elaine remembered of the lake. Or maybe she'd never paid attention. The notation suggested that Rose and Henry had retained ownership of something beyond just their cabin lot. But what? And why? Outside, the sun was setting, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Elaine stood on the dock with Rose's letter in her pocket and felt the first stirring of something that wasn't anxiety or grief. It was curiosity, maybe even the faint beginning of anger. Victoria Whitmore wanted her lawn mowed and her dock inspected, wanted her to comply with standards and regulations, wanted her to be a good neighbor, which really meant quiet and obedient and willing to erase herself to preserve someone else's vision of perfection. Rose had left her a puzzle and a promise, secrets that mattered, power that meant something. For the first time since David had asked for the divorce, since she'd lost her marriage and her home and her identity, Elaine felt something other than defeat. She felt the possibility of fight. The women's gathering Diane had mentioned was tonight. Elaine looked down at herself, at her suburban mom clothes and her sensible shoes. She looked like someone who would apologize for taking up space. She looked like someone Victoria could push around. She needed allies, needed information, needed to understand what Rose had left her before Victoria or anyone else decided what Elaine's life at Clearwater Lake would look like. She changed into clean jeans and a sweater that didn't have coffee stains, brushed her hair and left it down for once. In the mirror, she saw traces of the girl she used to be, the one who'd backpacked through Europe alone after college, the one who told her mother she was going to art school whether they paid for it or not, the one who'd existed before she'd learned to shrink herself to fit into David's world. Lainey, she said to her reflection. Not Elaine, not Mrs. Chen. Lainey Hutchinson, Rose's granddaughter. The community center was a 10-minute walk through the woods, following a path worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Lights glowed warm through the windows. Inside, she could hear laughter and the sound of women's voices layered over each other like a choir. She stood outside for a full minute, fear and hope warring in her chest. Every instinct told her to go back to the cabin, to hide, to not risk being seen and judged and found wanting. But Rose's letter was in her pocket, and Rose's blood was in her veins. And somewhere under all the years of making herself small was a woman who knew how to take up space. Lainey opened the door and walked into the light. The room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds, every face turning toward her. Then Diane was there, smiling like Lainey's arrival was the best thing that had happened all day, taking her arm and drawing her into the warmth. Everyone, this is Lainey Hutchinson, Rose's granddaughter. Lainey, welcome home. And in that moment, surrounded by the faces of strangers who had known Rose, who had loved her and been shaped by her, Lainey felt something shift inside her chest. Not a healing, not yet, but the first crack in the armor she'd built around herself. The first glimpse of light through the darkness. She was home. She was terrified. She was more lost than she'd ever been. But she was also, for the first time in 28 years, exactly where she needed to be. The inheritance wasn't the cabin or the land or whatever secrets Rose had left in that safe deposit box. The inheritance was permission. Permission to become someone she'd forgotten how to be. Permission to fight for something that mattered. Permission to take up space in her own life. Victoria Whitmore wanted to make her small. The divorce had tried to erase her. The years of marriage had taught her to disappear. But Rose had left her a different legacy. A legacy of stubborn independence and creative fire. and the absolute refusal to let anyone else define her worth. Lainey didn't know if she was strong enough to claim it, didn't know if she could find the woman she used to be or become someone entirely new. But standing in that community center, surrounded by the warm chaos of women who had chosen each other as family, she felt the first trembling possibility of hope. The fight was coming. Victoria and her regulations and her judgment, the mystery of water rights and what Rose had protected, the work of rebuilding a self from the fragments of who she'd been and who she might still become. Lainey was 52 years old and starting over from nothing. But nothing, it turned out, was exactly where transformation began. She took a deep breath, accepted a plate of food from someone whose name she didn't catch, and stepped into her inheritance. Not the cabin, not the land, but the terrifying, exhilarating freedom to finally, after all these years, be herself. The morning after the women's gathering, Lainey woke to the sound of rain hammering against the cabin roof like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Her head throbbed from too much wine and too many stories, her heart full of names and faces she was still trying to match. Grace Martinez, 70 years old with a laugh that could shake rafters, who'd lost her husband 5 years back and refused to act like a widow. Linda Oates, who'd come out at 58 and watched half her friends vanish like smoke. Priya Kapoor, juggling 3 teenage sons alone and working double shifts at the hospital. Women who'd survived divorces and deaths and the quiet erasure that happens when the world decides you've aged out of maturity. They'd welcomed her like she belonged there, like Rose's blood in her veins was passport enough. They'd fed her casseroles and asked gentle questions, and told her things about Rose she'd never known. How Rose had organized the first women's circle 15 years ago, after a particularly brutal HOA meeting, where Victoria had reduced a widow to tears over lawn violations. How Rose had painted portraits of half the women in the room, refusing payment but accepting pie, or fresh fish, or help winterizing the cabin. How Rose had been the one person Victoria couldn't intimidate, couldn't shame, couldn't make small. "Your grandmother was a force of nature," Grace had said, her dark eyes bright with memory. Victoria tried to fine her once for having too many garden gnomes. Rose told her where she could put her fine and added 3 more gnomes the next day. Spelled out a message if you looked at them right. The women had dissolved into laughter, the kind that comes from shared defiance, from finding humor in the small rebellions that keep you human. Now, in the gray light of morning, Lainey felt the weight of that legacy pressing down like a physical thing. She was not a force of nature. She was a woman who'd spent 3 decades perfecting the art of not making waves, not causing trouble, not being seen. The gap between who Rose had been and who Lainey was felt unbridgeable as the lake itself. She made coffee in the ancient percolator and sat at the small kitchen table with Rose's letter spread out before her. The words hadn't changed overnight. Water rights, First Mountain Bank, the key behind the watercolor box lining. She'd found it last night after returning from the gathering, her fingers clumsy with wine and exhaustion. A small brass key that fit nothing in the cabin, which meant it opened something elsewhere. The bank opened at 9. It was barely 7 now, the rain showing no signs of letting up. Lainey dressed in layers, the closest thing to waterproof she owned, and ate toast standing over the sink while watching the lake dissolve into sheets of rain. Somewhere out there, Victoria Whitmore was probably cataloging violations, measuring grass height with a ruler, planning her next move. The thought made Lainey's stomach clench. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma Chen. "Heard you made it to Circle last night. Proud of you. Call if you need anything." The simple kindness of it made Lainey's throat tight. She wasn't used to women offering help without expecting something in return. Wasn't used to the easy solidarity she'd felt last night. The sense that these strangers had her back simply because she needed backing. Another text. This one from her daughter Sophie in New York. "Mom, are you okay? You haven't posted anything in days. Your silence is freaking me out." Lainey stared at the phone, trying to compose a response that wouldn't sound like a lie. "I'm fine" felt insulting to them both. "I'm figuring things out" was closer to truth but raised more questions than it answered. Finally, she typed, "I'm at the lake. It's good here. I'll call you tonight. Love you." The response came immediately, a heart emoji and, "Love you too. Call me. I mean it." 28 years of being Sophie's mother, And Lainey was still learning that her daughter was stronger than she'd given her credit for. Still learning that the protection she'd offered, the shield of perfection she'd tried to maintain, had maybe hurt more than helped. Sophie had grown up thinking marriage meant erasing yourself, that being a good wife meant disappearing into someone else's expectations. The divorce had shattered that illusion. But what came after was still being written. By 8:30, the rain had eased to a sullen drizzle. Lainey drove the 15 miles to town, windshield wipers keeping rhythm with her pulse. First Mountain Bank occupied a brick building on Main Street, the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for 50 years. Inside, it smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaner, the air conditioning too cold for the weather outside. The woman behind the customer service desk was maybe 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a nameplate that said Patricia Flynn. She looked up as Lainey approached, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or sympathy. "I'm Elaine Hutchinson," Lainey began, then corrected herself. "Lainey Hutchinson, Rose Hutchinson's granddaughter. I believe there's a safe deposit box in her name that was transferred to me." Patricia's face softened into something like grief. "Rose, God, I'm so sorry for your loss. She was one of the good ones." She stood, gesturing for Lainey to follow. "Let me check our records. I handled the estate transfer myself, actually." Rose was very specific about her wishes. They moved into a small office cluttered with files and family photos. Patricia pulled up something on her computer, squinting at the screen. "Yes, here we are. Box 247 transferred to Elaine Hutchinson upon Rose's death. I'll need to see your ID and the key." Lainey produced both, her hands steadier than she expected. Patricia examined them with the careful attention of someone who took her job seriously, then nodded and stood again. "This way." The vault was exactly what Lainey had imagined. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, rows of small metal doors with numbers stamped into them. Patricia unlocked box 247 with her master key, waited for Lainey to insert hers, then stepped back. "I'll give you privacy. Take all the time you need." Alone, Lainey pulled the long metal box from its slot and carried it to the small table in the center of the room. Her heart was hammering now, anticipation and dread mixing into something that tasted like copper. She lifted the lid. Inside was a treasure trove of secrets. Thick manila envelopes stuffed with documents, a smaller wooden box carved with flowers, a cassette tape in a plastic case labeled in Rose's handwriting, "For Lainey, when the time comes," and on top of everything, a letter in a cream envelope with just her name written in Rose's spidery script. Lainey opened the letter first. Her grandmother's voice seemed to speak from the page, clear as if she were standing right there. "My dearest Lainey, if you found this, then you've started asking the right questions. Good. It's about time. Your grandfather Henry and I bought this land in 1964 for $3,000. Back then, you could still own things outright. Water rights, mineral rights, everything that mattered. When developers started circling in the 70s, we sold surface lots but kept what was important. The lake bottom, the riparian rights, 300 feet from the original shoreline in every direction. Do you understand what that means, sweetheart? Every dock on this lake sits on property we owned. Every boat that moors there is trespassing, technically, though we never enforced it. We granted the HOA a license when it formed in 1982. $1 per year, renewable, revocable if they violated certain terms. Terms about fair treatment, about not harassing residents, about maintaining community, not control. I never told you because you were busy living your life, and I was glad of that. But I always knew you'd need this someday, that you'd come back when you were ready to fight. The documents are all here: surveys, deeds, the original agreement with the HOA founders. Everything you need to prove what belongs to you. Victoria Whitmore doesn't know about the water rights. Her father Martin knew. He was one of the original signers, but he never told her. Probably died hoping the secret would die with him. Use this wisely, Lainey. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not to hurt people, but to protect what matters. And remember, the most powerful inheritance isn't property. It's knowing who you are and refusing to be made small. I love you. I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't say it enough. Now go be the woman I always knew you could be. Your grandmother, Rose. Lainey had to read it twice through tears that blurred the words. Rose had known, had seen her shrinking herself, making herself invisible, and had left her the tools to become visible again. Not just visible, powerful. She opened the first manila envelope with shaking hands. Inside was the original survey from 1964, professionally drawn and notarized, showing the lake and surrounding properties. Hand-drawn boundaries clearly marked the water rights retained by Henry and Rose Hutchinson. A deed stamped and signed, and legally bulletproof, spelled out exactly what they owned. Not just the cabin lot, the entire lake bottom, the water itself. The second envelope contained the 1982 agreement between Henry and Rose and the original HOA founders. 8 signatures on faded paper, including one that made Lainey's breath catch. Martin Whitmore, Victoria's father. He'd known exactly what he was signing, had agreed to terms that explicitly stated the license could be revoked if the HOA engaged in discriminatory practices, harassment, or misuse of funds. Lainey thought about the women at the circle last night. Linda, forced to endure homophobic comments disguised as property value concerns. Priya, harassed about having too many cars when she was just a mother with teenage sons. Grace, who'd mentioned in passing that Victoria had tried to fine her for hanging laundry outside, claiming it was unsightly. The pattern was clear. The violations were documented in the collective memory of women who'd been made to feel small. The third envelope held financial records. Copies of HOA budgets from the past 10 years, highlighted in Rose's careful hand. Dock fees collected from every property on the lake, $200 per household annually. Over 15 years, that was hundreds of thousands of dollars supposedly going toward dock maintenance and lake improvements. But the expenditure record showed something else. Administrative costs that were vague and inflated. Legal consultations for matters that should have been handled internally. No actual receipts for dock repairs or lake management. Rose had been building a case, had spent years documenting the very violations that would justify revoking the HOA's license to use the lake. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it with the methodical patience of someone who understood that justice was a long game. The cassette tape sat there like a challenge. Lainey hadn't seen a tape player in years, but something told her she needed to hear this. She packed everything carefully back into the box, signed the paperwork Patricia provided, and carried it all to her car like she was transporting nitroglycerin. The drive back to the lake passed in a blur of rain and revelation. Lainey's mind spun with possibilities and implications. She owned the lake. Technically, legally, indisputably. Every single dock was built on her property. Victoria Whitmore, with all her regulations and standards and clipboard intimidation, had been collecting fees for 15 years on water rights she didn't own. The power of that knowledge felt dangerous. Lainey had never held power before, had spent her whole life accommodating and apologizing and making space for others. What did you do when suddenly you held all the cards? When the person trying to make you small had been standing on your property the whole time? Back at the cabin, she made more coffee and sat with the documents spread across the kitchen table. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and green. Through the window she could see her dock, could imagine Victoria standing there with her clipboard, measuring and judging and finding fault. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Her phone rang. Sarah Brennan, the name on the screen said. Lainey answered without thinking. Mrs. Hutchinson? This is Sarah Brennan. I'm a real estate attorney here in town. Diane Porter gave me your number, said you might benefit from some legal consultation. I hope it's not too forward of me to call. The voice was professional, but warm, with an underlying current of something that sounded like understanding. Lainey found herself saying yes before she'd fully processed the question. Yes, she could use legal help. Yes, today would be fine. Yes, 2 o'clock at the cabin worked perfectly. Sarah Brennan arrived exactly on time, driving a sensible Volvo that had seen better years. She was maybe mid-50s, Korean-American, with her hair cut short and practical, wearing jeans and a blazer that split the difference between casual and professional. When she shook Lainey's hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were direct. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Lainey began, suddenly nervous. Sarah smiled. Diane said Rose's granddaughter needed help, and that was enough for me. Rose painted my portrait once, did you know that? After my divorce. I was a mess, and she just showed up one day with her easel and said she wanted to capture me before I turned into someone else. That portrait hangs in my office. Reminds me of who I was when I stopped letting my ex-husband define me. The shared experience sat between them like a bridge. Two women, divorced, rebuilding. Two women who'd been made to feel small and were learning to take up space again. Sarah settled at the kitchen table and pulled out a legal pad and pen, old school in a way that reminded Lainey of Rose. So, Diane said you've discovered some interesting information about your property. Lainey pushed the documents across the table. That's putting it mildly. She watched Sarah's expression change as she read. Surprise first, then something sharper. Recognition, maybe, or vindication. The attorney went through every page with careful attention, making notes, occasionally asking questions. Her fingers lingered on the 1982 agreement, on Martin Whitmore's signature. "This is ironclad," Sarah said finally. "You own the water rights. Every dock on this lake is built on your property. The HOA has been operating under a revocable license that explicitly states it can be terminated if they violate certain conditions." She looked up, eyes bright. "And from what I know about Victoria Whitmore, she's violated every single one of those conditions multiple times." Lainey felt something cold settle in her stomach. What does that mean? It means you have options. You could charge market rate for dock access, which would be thousands per household annually. You could revoke the license entirely and force everyone to remove their docks. Or, Sarah paused, her expression softening, you could use this as leverage to force the HOA to change, to stop the harassment, to create the kind of community Rose wanted. "I don't want to hurt people," Lainey said quietly. "I just want to be left alone." Sarah nodded like she'd expected this answer. "I understand, but here's the thing about bullies. They don't stop unless you make them. Victoria has been terrorizing this community for years. I know because she's done it to my clients. Forced sales, harassment campaigns, using HOA authority like a weapon. Someone needs to stop her." "Why me?" "Because you have the power to do it." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "And because sometimes the universe puts the right weapon in the right hands at the right time. You don't have to decide today, but you should know what you're holding here. This isn't just property rights. This is justice." After Sarah left, promising to research precedents and prepare options, Lainey sat on the screen porch and watched the lake. The water was gray under cloudy skies, ruffled by wind into patterns that looked almost alive. Somewhere out there, Victoria was in her mansion, secure in her power, unaware that the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Lainey thought about the women from last night, Grace and Linda and Priya and all the others who'd been made to feel less than. Thought about Eleanor Hart, who Diane had mentioned in passing, a woman who'd been forced to sell her home 8 years ago over manufactured violations. Thought about how many others there might be, scattered across the years of Victoria's reign. The responsible thing would be to consult more lawyers, to plan carefully, to approach this with caution and restraint. The old Lainey, the one who'd been David's wife, would have done exactly that, would have agonized over every decision, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of causing conflict. But that Lainey was disappearing, eroding like shoreline under winter storms. In her place was someone Lainey didn't quite recognize yet, someone who'd inherited not just a cabin, but a calling, someone Rose had believed in even when Lainey hadn't believed in herself. Her phone rang again. This time it was Emma Chen. "Hey, I hope I'm not bothering you. I was just thinking, if you need help with anything around the cabin, I'm free this afternoon, no charge, just neighboring." The kindness in the offer made Lainey's throat tight. "Actually, I could use some company, and maybe some advice." Emma arrived an hour later with her daughter Zoe in tow, a 14-year-old with purple streaks in her black hair and an expression of studied boredom that didn't quite hide curiosity. While Emma checked the hot water heater and tightened loose boards on the porch, Zoe wandered through the cabin, picking up Rose's things with careful hands. "Your grandmother was an artist," Zoe said, not quite a question. Lainey looked at the paintings on the walls, the watercolors of the lake in different seasons, the oil portrait of a young woman Lainey didn't recognize. She was. "I used to be too, before I gave it up." "Why'd you give it up?" The question, so direct and innocent, landed like a punch. Lainey found herself answering honestly. Because I thought being a wife and mother meant not being anything else. Because I made myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. Zoe considered this, her young face serious. That sucks. Yeah. Lainey felt something like laughter bubble up. It really does. Later, sitting on the porch with Emma while Zoe sketched the lake with supplies she'd found in Rose's art box, Lainey told Emma about the water rights, about the documents in the safe deposit box, about the choice she was facing. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her capable hand still on her coffee mug. Victoria tried to force me out 2 years ago, she said finally, claimed my work truck was a commercial vehicle and violated residential zoning. Never mind that half the men on this lake have work trucks parked in their driveways. She filed complaints, threatened legal action, made my life hell for 6 months. What did you do? I fought back, hired a lawyer I couldn't afford, proved she was applying rules selectively. She backed down eventually, but it cost me. Not just money, energy, peace of mind. Emma looked at Lainey directly. There are a dozen women on this lake with similar stories. More, probably. Women she targets because she knows we're vulnerable. Single moms, divorcees, women living alone. She's got a type. What do you think I should do? Emma smiled, small and fierce. I think you should do what Rose would do, make her regret underestimating you. That night, Lainey finally found a cassette player at the thrift store in town. Ancient and dusty, but functional. She took it back to the cabin, made dinner from Diane's casserole and her own growing sense of purpose, and sat on the porch as the sun set in streaks of orange and gold. The tape clicked into place, static first, then Rose's voice, older and breathless, but unmistakably hers. Lainey, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, you've found everything. You've learned what your grandfather and I protected all these years. You're probably scared. Probably wondering what the hell to do with all this power you never asked for. Let me tell you something about power, baby girl. It's not about control. It's not about making other people small. Power is about having choices, about being able to say no and have it matter, about protecting the things and people you love. Victoria Whitmore has been using false power for years, authority she doesn't actually have, intimidation and paperwork and the assumption that people won't fight back. You have real power now, legal, documented, bulletproof. What you do with it will define who you become. I can't tell you what choice to make, but I can tell you this. The lake doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to itself. We were just its stewards. Good stewards protect, bad stewards control. Be the good steward, Lainey, not for me. For yourself. For the community that needs someone brave enough to stand up. And remember, you're not alone. You never were. You just forgot how to see the people standing beside you. I love you. I'm proud of you. Now go show Victoria Whitmore what happens when you corner a woman who's finally done being small. The recording ended with a click. Silence filled the porch, heavy with implication and invitation. Across the lake, lights were coming on in the expensive homes, in Victoria's mansion with its perfect landscaping and its foundation built on lies. Lainey sat in Rose's chair and felt the weight of decision pressing down. She could use this information quietly, negotiate with Victoria privately, secure her own peace without causing waves. That would be the safe choice, the expected choice. Or she could do what Rose had prepared her for. Not revenge, justice. Not destruction, transformation. Not making Victoria small, making the community whole. Her phone lit up with a text from Grace Martinez. Circle meeting tomorrow night. Hope you can make it. We're discussing Victoria's latest power grab. Special assessment she's trying to push through. Your timing couldn't be better. Lainey stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, I'll be there, and I have some information everyone needs to hear. The response came immediately. A string of prayer hand emojis, and Rose would be so proud. The words settled into Lainey's chest like stones in a riverbed, solid and permanent. Rose would be proud. Maybe for the first time in her life, Lainey was becoming someone she could be proud of too. She walked down to the dock. Her dock, built on her property, extending over her water. The lake was dark now, reflecting stars that were just beginning to appear as clouds cleared. Somewhere in that darkness were the boundaries Rose and Henry had protected, invisible lines that meant everything. Tomorrow, she would call Sarah and start building the case, would gather the women who'd been hurt and document the violations, would prepare for the fight that was coming because Victoria wouldn't go quietly, wouldn't surrender power without burning everything down first. But tonight, Lainey stood on her dock and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not yet, but purpose, direction, the sense that her life was finally her own. The inheritance Rose had left wasn't the cabin or the water rights or even the documents in the safe deposit box. It was permission. Permission to be powerful. Permission to fight back. Permission to become the woman she'd always been meant to be before life and marriage and fear had taught her to shrink. Lainey Hutchinson was 52 years old, divorced, broke, starting over from nothing. But she owned a lake, and she was just beginning to understand what that meant. The war was coming. The reckoning. The moment when Victoria Whitmore would learn that some women, when pushed far enough, don't break. They gather their strength, they remember who they are, they stand their ground, and they fight back with everything they have. Lainey walked back to the cabin with Rose's voice still echoing in her ears, and the lake stretching out behind her like a promise. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, she allowed herself to hope, and hope, she was learning, was the first step toward everything else. The community center smelled of burnt coffee and old grudges when Lainey arrived for the women's circle that evening. She carried Rose's documents in a leather portfolio she'd found at the thrift store, the weight of them substantial as evidence always was. Outside, the May rain had turned to mist, softening the edges of everything, making the world feel like it existed between states. Solid and liquid, past and future, who she'd been and who she was becoming. Grace Martinez met her at the door, her weathered face breaking into a smile that held something fierce underneath. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." There was weight in those words, years of disappointment from women who'd promised to stand up and then vanished when the actual standing required courage. "I'm here," Lainey said, and felt the truth of it in her bones. Not just present in body, but committed in a way she hadn't been committed to anything in decades. Not her marriage, not her children's activities, not even her own life. But this somehow mattered. Inside, women filled the folding chairs in configurations that spoke of alliance and uncertainty. Diane Porter sat in the front row, flannel shirt and reading glasses, looking like everyone's favorite teacher. Emma Chen leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, her daughter Zoe beside her with sketchbook open. Linda Oates and her partner Rachel occupied chairs near the window, holding hands in a way that suggested they'd fought for the right to do so publicly. Priya Kapoor looked exhausted, still wearing her hospital scrubs, her dark hair escaping its bun. And there, near the door like she was ready to bolt, sat a woman Lainey didn't recognize. Late 40s, professionally dressed, with Victoria Whitmore's bone structure and none of her carefully maintained armor. The woman caught Lainey staring and offered a small, sad smile before looking away. The meeting started with the usual business: fundraiser for the community garden, schedule for beach cleanup day. Then Grace cleared her throat and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Everyone knew what was coming. "We need to discuss Victoria's special assessment proposal." Grace's voice carried the kind of authority that came from living long enough to see through bullshit. $32,000 per household for infrastructure improvements that nobody voted on and nobody needs, due in 60 days or face penalties, including potential foreclosure. The room erupted, women talking over each other, anger and fear mixing into something combustible. Lainey listened to the stories. Amy Wilson, the young mother with twin daughters, confessing she'd already taken out a second mortgage and couldn't afford another dime. Margaret Sullivan, whose fixed income from her late husband's pension wouldn't stretch to cover groceries in this assessment. Linda talking about how she and Rachel had just finished paying off medical debt from Rachel's cancer treatment. "It's deliberate," Emma said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She's targeting people who can't pay, forcing them to sell. Seen it before." "What are we supposed to do?" Amy's question came out broken. "I can't lose my home. My girls, they've never known anywhere else." The silence that followed was the sound of powerlessness, of women who'd been backed into corners so many times they'd forgotten there might be other options. Lainey felt it pressing down, that familiar weight of inevitability, the sense that some people made the rules and the rest of you just had to survive them. Then she stood. The portfolio in her hands felt like a weapon or a shield, she wasn't sure which. I have something everyone needs to see. Her voice shook but held. My grandmother left me some documents. About the lake, about who actually owns what. Grace's eyes sharpened. What kind of documents? Lainey opened the portfolio, and the legal surveys from 1964 spilled across the folding table, like cards in a winning hand. The ones that show my grandfather and grandmother retained water rights to the entire lake when they sold the surface lots. Every dock, every mooring, every inch of lake bottom. It all belongs to me. The room went so quiet, Lainey could hear the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Then everyone started talking at once, questions and exclamations blending into white noise. Grace raised her hand, and the decades of teaching authority in that gesture brought silence. Explain, she said. So Lainey did. Told them about the safe deposit box in Rose's letter, about the 1982 agreement that granted the HOA a revocable license for $1 per year, conditional on fair treatment and proper governance, about the dock fees Victoria had been collecting for 15 years on property she didn't own, about the harassment and selective enforcement that violated every term of the original agreement. Sarah Brennan stood from where she'd been sitting quietly in the back. I've reviewed the documents. Everything Lainey is saying is legally sound. She owns the lake bottom. The HOA has been operating under a license that can be revoked. And based on the evidence of harassment and financial mismanagement, there's more than sufficient cause to revoke it. What does that mean? Amy again, hope creeping into her voice. It means Victoria doesn't have the power she thinks she has. Sarah moved to the front, lawyer mode fully engaged. It means the special assessment is built on a foundation of sand. It means we have leverage. The woman who looked like Victoria stood abruptly. Everyone turned. She was pale, hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. I'm Rebecca Sterling, Victoria Whitmore's sister. We haven't spoken in 10 years, but I heard about this meeting through the volunteer network at the hospital. She looked directly at Lainey. My father was Martin Whitmore. He signed that 1982 agreement you're talking about. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he never told Victoria, kept it secret his whole life. Why? Grace's question held no judgment, just curiosity. Because he was a controlling bastard who got off on having power over people, including his own daughters. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. He manipulated Victoria her entire life. Shame was his favorite tool. When she got pregnant at 21, before marriage, he held it over her like a sword, made her believe she was worthless unless she was perfect. That's why she's the way she is now, trying to control everyone else the way he controlled her. That doesn't excuse what she's done, Linda said quietly. Rebecca shook her head. It doesn't, but it explains it. And maybe if we understand why she became this person, we can figure out how to stop her without destroying what's left of her humanity. The discussion that followed was heated and raw. Some women wanted blood, wanted Victoria humiliated and broken the way she'd broken others. Others, especially the older ones who'd known Victoria before her daughter's death, wanted compassion tempered with justice. Lainey listened to all of it, feeling the weight of decision pressing down. Finally, Grace turned to her. You're the one holding the cards, Lainey. What do you want to do? The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did she want? Revenge would be easy, satisfying even. She could revoke the lake license, charge market rates for dock access, bankrupt Victoria through legal fees and lost revenue. Could make the woman who'd tried to make her small feel exactly how small that felt. But as she looked around the room at these women, survivors all of them, fighters who'd chosen community over cruelty even when cruelty would have been easier, Lainey knew what Rose would have wanted. Not destruction. Transformation. I want justice, not revenge. Her voice was stronger now, sure. I want Victoria held accountable. I want the harassment to stop. I want this community to be what Rose believed it could be. A place where people support each other instead of tearing each other down. How? Emma asked. Practical as always. We use the leverage to force change. Sarah was already making notes. File a quiet title action to establish Lainey's ownership beyond any doubt. Present evidence of HOA mismanagement and harassment to the membership. Demand new elections, term limits, transparent accounting. Offer Victoria a choice. Step down voluntarily and seek help, or face legal action that will expose everything. She'll never step down, Diane said sadly. She'd rather burn it all down. Then we let her try. Grace's smile was sharp. And we'll be ready. The meeting lasted another 2 hours, planning and strategizing, dividing responsibilities. Julia Montgomery, the journalist who'd covered local issues for 20 years, agreed to investigate the financial records. Eleanor Hart, the woman who'd been forced out 8 years ago, offered to coordinate testimony from other victims. Amy Wilson, no longer trembling, volunteered to canvass residents who might be wavering, who could be convinced to vote for change. As people filtered out, Rebecca approached Lainey. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I know you don't know me. Don't owe me anything. But Victoria is still my sister. If there's any way to do this that doesn't completely destroy her, I'd be grateful. Lainey thought about Sophie and Ben, about the love that persisted even through divorce and distance and disappointment, about how family was both blessing and burden, how you could hate someone and love them in the same breath. I'll try, she said, but I won't sacrifice these women's safety for your sister's pride. Rebecca nodded. That's all I'm asking, that you try. After everyone left, Lainey and Grace sat alone in the empty community center. The older woman looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that went bone deep. But there was satisfaction in her eyes, too. You did good tonight, Grace said. Rose would be proud. I'm terrified, Lainey admitted. What if this makes everything worse? What if Victoria comes after me harder? What if I'm not strong enough to see this through? Grace reached over and took her hand. The gesture was maternal in a way that made Lainey's throat tight. You know what I learned when my husband died? Being strong doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway. You're stronger than you think, Mija. You just forgot for a while. The drive back to the cabin took Lainey past Victoria's mansion, lit up like a fortress against the night. She could see movement through the windows, shadows that might have been Victoria pacing, planning her next move. The woman had no idea yet what was coming. No idea the ground had shifted beneath her perfectly manicured lawn. Lainey felt something twist in her gut. Not quite guilt, but close to it. Sympathy, maybe, for a woman so damaged by her father's control that she'd spent decades inflicting the same damage on others. But sympathy didn't mean surrender. Understanding didn't equal acceptance. At home, the cabin felt different. Still small, still shabby, still filled with Rose's ghost. But also hers now in a way it hadn't been before. She made tea in Rose's chipped mug and sat on the screen porch watching the lake turn silver under moonlight. Somewhere out there in the darkness was the boundary line, the invisible demarcation between what was hers and what was Victoria's. Except Victoria didn't own anything, not really, just occupied space on borrowed authority. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. I've drafted the legal filing, want to review it before we submit? Also, you should know, word is spreading. Victoria will hear about the meeting soon if she hasn't already. Another text, this one from her daughter Sophie. Mom, are you okay? I keep having this feeling that something big is happening. Call me? Lainey dialed without overthinking it. Sophie picked up on the second ring. Mom. Thank God, I've been worried sick. Your texts are getting weird. All this stuff about finding yourself in the lake and grandmother's legacy. It sounds like a midlife crisis. Maybe it is. Lainey surprised herself by laughing. Or maybe it's a midlife awakening. There's a difference. What's going on? Sophie's voice softened. Really, no deflecting. So Lainey told her. About the divorce fallout and the inheritance. About Victoria's harassment and the water rights discovery. About standing up in a room full of women and choosing to fight. She told her daughter everything, the fear and exhilaration mixing together until they were indistinguishable. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then, Mom, I don't think I've ever heard you sound like this. Like what? Like yourself. Like the person you were before you married Dad. Before you turned into this perfect suburban robot who never said what she really thought or did what she really wanted. Her voice cracked. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for you to find this. The words landed in Lainey's chest and stuck there, sharp and sweet simultaneously. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear them. Hadn't known she was waiting for her daughter's approval, for permission to be someone other than the mother Sophie had always known. I'm coming up there, Sophie said suddenly. This weekend. I want to see this place, meet these women, understand what you're fighting for. You don't have to do that. I know, but I want to. Sophie's determination came through the line clear as a bell. Besides, someone should document this. Make sure when you take down the HOA Tyrant, there's a record. I'm bringing my camera. They talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through memories and confessions. Sophie admitted she'd been angry about the divorce at first, had blamed Lainey for not fighting harder to keep the family together. Now she understood. Some families needed to break apart so the people in them could become whole. After they hung up, Lainey sat with her tea and felt something shift inside her ribcage. Not a healing, not yet, but space opening up where there'd been only compression before. Room to breathe, room to grow, room to become whoever she was supposed to be next. The next morning brought fog thick as wool and a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her thumb the accept button. Mrs. Hutchinson? This is Bradford Sterling, attorney for the Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association. I represent Victoria Whitmore in her capacity as HOA president. I understand you've been spreading claims about property ownership that are, frankly, spurious and potentially actionable as defamation. The voice was smooth as oil and just as slick. Lainey felt her pulse spike but kept her voice level. I haven't been spreading anything except legal facts. Facts supported by recorded deeds and surveys. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that should you continue to make these claims, pursue legal action, or otherwise interfere with HOA governance, we will have no choice but to file suit for harassment, defamation, and tortious interference. The penalties for such actions can be substantial. It was a threat dressed up in legalese. Lainey recognized it because she'd heard it before. Different context, but same energy. David's lawyer during the divorce, using big words and bigger threats to make her settle for less than she deserved. Her father, when she'd insisted on art school, warning her she'd end up homeless and alone. Every man who'd ever tried to make her smaller by making her afraid. Mr. Sterling, you should know I'm represented by Sarah Brennan. All future communications should go through her. And you should also know that everything I'm claiming is documented, notarized, and completely defensible in court. If Victoria wants to sue me for telling the truth, she's welcome to try. She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking with adrenaline. The fog outside seemed thicker suddenly, pressing against the windows like it was trying to get in. Her phone rang again immediately. Sarah this time. Victoria's lawyer just called me too. He's bluffing. They have nothing. Sarah sounded almost gleeful. But it means Victoria knows. She's scared. Scared people make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The kind that give us more ammunition. Sarah paused. I need to warn you, though. Things are going to get worse before they get better. Victoria won't go quietly. Make sure your doors are locked and your security is tight. The warning settled cold in Lainey's stomach. She walked through the cabin, checking locks she'd never bothered with before, pulling curtains she usually left open. The fog transformed familiar views into something alien. She couldn't see the lake anymore, couldn't see the neighboring cabins, just gray void in every direction. Her phone buzzed with the text from Emma. Heard Victoria's lawyer is making threats. You okay? Another from Grace. Don't let them scare you. We've got your back. Another from Diane. Making soup. Come over for lunch. Safety in numbers. The texts kept coming. A chorus of support that pushed back against the isolation Victoria's tactics were designed to create. Lainey realized that was the difference between then and now. During the divorce, she'd faced everything alone, had let David's lawyer intimidate her into silence, had settled for scraps because she didn't know she deserved more. But now she had witnesses, allies, women who understood what it meant to be made small, and had decided collectively they were done shrinking. She went to Diane's for lunch. The older woman's cabin was everything Victoria would hate. Cluttered and comfortable, mismatched furniture and walls covered in photos of people Diane had taught over 40 years of service. The soup was thick and warm and tasted like coming home. They sat at the kitchen table, rain starting up outside, and Diane told stories about Rose, how they'd met at a PTA meeting 30 years ago, and bonded over shared contempt for administrative bullshit, how Rose had nursed Diane through breast cancer, showing up every day with food and terrible jokes and absolute refusal to let her friend give up, how in the last months before Rose died, She'd talked constantly about Lainey, worried about her granddaughter in a way that suggested she saw more than Lainey had realized. She knew you were disappearing, Diane said gently. Knew you'd lost yourself in that marriage. She told me once, my Lainey is so busy being what everyone needs. She forgot to be what she needs. Broke her heart. Why didn't she say something? The question came out raw. She did. You just weren't ready to hear it yet. Diane's smile was sad. Sometimes we have to hit bottom before we can push back up. Rose understood that, so she left you the tools you'd need when you were ready to use them. Outside, the rain intensified. Through the window, Lainey could see the lake churning, whitecaps forming where the wind pushed against the current. Weather moving in, the kind of spring storm that reminded you nature didn't care about your plans or your fear. There's going to be an emergency HOA meeting, Diane said, pulling up an email on her phone. Victoria just called it. Tomorrow night. Special session to address, quote, malicious rumors and unfounded claims threatening community stability, unquote. She's moving faster than I expected. She's desperate. Diane set down her phone and looked at Lainey with the directness of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth. You need to be ready. She won't just argue. She'll try to destroy you, your credibility, your character, everything. That's what people like Victoria do when they're cornered. I'm not sure I can face that. The admission felt like failure. Yes, you can, because you won't be facing it alone. Diane reached across the table and gripped Lainey's hand. Every woman who's been hurt by Victoria will be in that room. Every person who's tired of living under her thumb. You think you're leading this, but really you're just the catalyst. The thing that finally gave everyone else permission to fight back. The words settled into Lainey like seeds in soil. She wasn't alone, had never been alone, just convinced herself she was, because that's what a lifetime of conditioning had taught her. That good women didn't make waves, that keeping peace meant keeping quiet, that your value was measured by how little space you took up. But Rose had taken up space, had painted and fished and told the HOA to go to hell when they tried to tell her how to live, had protected water rights and fought developers, and left her granddaughter a legacy that was equal parts property deed and permission slip. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the following evening. Lainey spent the day in preparation that felt like putting on armor. Sarah came by with documents organized into presentations, strategies mapped out in careful detail. Emma and Zoe arrived with casserole and solidarity, the teenager surprising everyone by offering to take notes during the meeting, her young face serious with the weight of witnessing history. Sophie called from the road. I'm 4 hours out. Don't start the revolution without me. The joke landed lighter than it should have, but Lainey was grateful for it anyway. She dressed carefully that evening. Not in the suburban mom uniform she'd worn for decades, but in jeans and one of Rose's old flannel shirts, soft from 1,000 washings. She looked in the mirror and saw someone unfamiliar. Not the polished wife or the perfect mother, just Lainey. Finally, completely unapologetically herself. The community center was already packed when she arrived an hour early, people lining the walls when all the chairs filled. She recognized faces from the women's circle, from decades-old memories of childhood summers, from the grocery store and post office, and all the small exchanges that made up community. They nodded as she passed, small gestures of solidarity that felt enormous. But there were also men now. Richard Whitmore sat in the back, Victoria's husband, looking older than his 64 years. Chris Wilson had brought his father, a retired contractor who'd built half the cabins on the lake. Ben appeared at Lainey's side, her son having driven straight from Boston. I'm here, Mom, Ben said quietly, whatever you need. His presence steadied something in Lainey's chest. Her children, both coming to stand with her, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Victoria arrived exactly at 7, dressed like she was going to court, power suit in navy blue, heels that clicked authority with every step, hair and makeup immaculate. Behind her came Bradford Sterling, expensive briefcase and practiced condescension. They took positions at the front table like generals surveying a battlefield. Victoria called the meeting to order with a voice that expected obedience and got silence instead. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We're here to address serious allegations that threaten the stability of our community, false claims about property ownership, attempts to undermine legitimate HOA authority, harassment disguised as advocacy. She spoke for 20 minutes, her presentation slick and practiced, charts showing property values, testimonials from satisfied residents, legal opinions from Sterling about HOA authority. She painted a picture of Lainey as an outsider, a troublemaker, someone whose grief and divorce had made her unstable and vindictive. Mrs. Hutchinson has been spreading rumors, Victoria said, her voice dripping sympathy that fooled exactly no one. Claims that she somehow owns the lake, that the HOA has been operating illegally, that I've been collecting fees without authority. These claims are not just false, they're dangerous. They threaten property values and community cohesion. They must be addressed. When Victoria finished, the room erupted. People shouting questions, making accusations, years of repressed anger suddenly given permission to surface. Sterling tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Victoria's perfect composure cracked at the edges, her eyes darting around the room like she was seeing these people, really seeing them for the first time. Grace stood, and the force of her presence brought quiet. Mrs. Whitmore, I have a question. Did your father, Martin, sign an agreement in 1982 granting Henry and Rose Hutchinson retained water rights? Victoria's face went blank. I don't know what you're talking about. Grace pulled out a copy of the agreement, Martin Whitmore's signature clearly visible. Because this document suggests he did, and that you've been operating under a revocable license for years, a license that can be terminated if the HOA violates certain conditions. Conditions you've violated repeatedly. The temperature in the room changed. You could feel it. The shift from confusion to understanding, from fear to anger. Bradford Sterling was whispering urgently to Victoria, but she wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on that signature, her father's handwriting from beyond the grave exposing secrets he'd kept to maintain control. Sarah stood next, lawyer mode fully engaged. I'm Sarah Brennan, representing Lainey Hutchinson. I have here certified copies of the 1964 survey, the original deed, and the 1982 agreement. All legally recorded, all completely valid. My client owns the water rights to this lake. Every dock is built on her property. The fees you've been collecting belong to her. And the harassment documented by multiple residents gives her legal grounds to revoke your license entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Eleanor Hart stood, the woman who'd been forced out 8 years ago, now returned like a ghost with unfinished business. Victoria made my life hell until I couldn't afford to stay. Manufactured violations, constant fines, made me feel like I was crazy for thinking I had rights. I lost my home because of her. One by one, others stood. Linda talking about homophobic harassment, Priya about discrimination against single mothers, Amy about being pressured to take on debt she couldn't afford. The stories built on each other, a chorus of testimony that painted a picture not of governance, but of tyranny. Then Richard Whitmore stood. His voice shook but carried. I'm Victoria's husband, and I need to say something. He looked at his wife, pain evident in every line of his face. I've enabled her for 12 years, since Melissa died. I watched her hurt people and said nothing because I was afraid of losing her too. That makes me complicit. He turned to the room. I'm sorry, to everyone she's hurt, and to my wife, for not loving her enough to make her get help. The confession hung in the air. Victoria sat frozen through all of it, her perfect facade finally crumbling. When the testimonies ended and Sarah asked if Victoria had anything to say, the woman just shook her head. For the first time since Lainey had met her, Victoria Whitmore had nothing to say. That was when Lainey stood. She hadn't planned to speak, had thought Sarah would handle everything. But looking at Victoria, seeing not a tyrant, but a broken woman trying to control a world that had hurt her, Lainey found words she didn't know she had. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand loss. My marriage ended, my identity disappeared. I know what it's like to feel like if you can't control something, anything, you'll fly apart completely. The room was silent now, everyone listening. But you can't heal by hurting others. You can't make yourself whole by breaking people around you. Your father controlled you, so you learned to control everyone else. That cycle has to end. She pulled out the documents, held them up so everyone could see. I could revoke your license right now, could charge market rates for dock access, could bankrupt this HOA and everyone in it. I have that power. The pause felt eternal. Then Lainey continued, her voice stronger. But that's not what my grandmother would want. So here's my offer. New elections, new leadership, term limits and transparent accounting, anti-harassment policies with real teeth. You step down, get help, and this community moves forward. Or we go to court, expose everything, and let the legal system handle it. Victoria finally looked up, her eyes meeting Lainey's across the crowded room. For a moment, something passed between them, recognition maybe. Understanding that they were both just women trying to survive in a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. I need time, Victoria said, her voice barely audible. You have 48 hours. Sarah's tone was firm but not cruel. After that, we file. The meeting ended in chaos, people arguing and celebrating and trying to process what had just happened. Lainey found herself surrounded by women, hands reaching out to touch her shoulders, her arms, grounding her in solidarity. Sophie appeared at her side, camera around her neck, tears streaming down her face. Mom, that was incredible. You were incredible. I don't feel incredible. Lainey felt hollowed out, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. I feel like I just blew up someone's life. You gave her a choice. Sophie's voice was fierce, more than she gave anyone else. Ben joined them, his arm around Lainey's shoulders. Dad called me yesterday, asked me to convince you to drop this. I told him to go to hell. His voice held pride. You're teaching me what strength actually looks like, Mom. Not bullying, standing up for what's right even when it's hard. They drove back to the cabin through rain that had intensified into a full spring storm, lightning illuminating the lake in brief flashes. Inside, with the door locked and the propane heater glowing, Lainey finally let herself collapse. She'd done it, had stood up, spoken truth, faced down the person who'd tried to make her small. But victory didn't feel like she'd expected. It felt complicated and messy and tinged with sympathy for a woman who'd spent decades using the same tactics that had been used on her. Hurt people, the saying went, and breaking that cycle required more than just winning. It required mercy alongside justice. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. This is Rebecca Sterling, Victoria's sister. Thank you for what you did tonight, for giving her a chance instead of just destroying her. I know you didn't have to do that. Lainey stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a response. Everyone deserves a chance to change, even when they don't deserve mercy. Especially then. The reply came quickly. That's more grace than my father ever showed either of us. Maybe that's what breaks the cycle. Maybe it was. Lainey set down her phone and looked at her children, at Sophie and Ben who'd driven hours to stand with her, at the cabin walls covered in Rose's paintings, at the lake beyond the windows, dark and wild, and somehow hers, in a way that had nothing to do with property rights and everything to do with belonging. She'd started this journey broken and lost. She wasn't fixed yet, wasn't whole, but she was standing, fighting, refusing to be small. And tomorrow, whatever Victoria decided, whatever came next, Lainey would face it as herself, not someone's wife or mother or granddaughter, though she was all those things, but as Lainey Hutchinson, woman who owned a lake and was just beginning to understand what power really meant. The storm raged outside. Inside, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lainey felt at peace. The war wasn't over. The real work of transformation, both hers and the community's, was just beginning. But tonight, she'd won a battle she hadn't known she was capable of fighting. And that was enough. The 48 hours that followed the emergency meeting felt like existing in the eye of a hurricane. The storm had passed, but everyone knew more weather was coming. Lainey spent the first morning with Sophie, showing her daughter the lake in early light, the mist rising off the water like the earth was exhaling secrets. They walked the property line, Sophie filming on her phone, asking questions that made Lainey think harder about what she was fighting for. Why does it matter so much, Mom? The property rights, I mean. You could just sell the cabin and walk away. Lainey watched a great blue heron pick its way through the shallows, patient and deliberate. Because running away is what I've been doing my whole life. Because Rose left me something worth protecting. Because those women at the meeting, they deserve to live without fear. She turned to face her daughter. And because for the first time in 30 years, I'm not asking permission to exist. I'm just existing. Sophie lowered her camera, eyes bright with something that looked like pride. Dad called me yesterday. Asked me to talk you out of this. Said you were having some kind of breakdown. What did you tell him? That he wouldn't recognize a breakthrough if it bit him in the ass. Sophie's grin was fierce. And that maybe if he'd paid attention to who you actually were instead of who he wanted you to be, you'd still be married. The words landed soft as a blessing. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, the kind that only happens between people who've stopped performing for each other. Inside, Lainey made breakfast while Sophie edited footage, the domestic rhythm feeling both familiar and completely new. Sarah called at 9. No word from Victoria yet. Sterling keeps asking for extensions, but we're holding firm. How are you holding up? I don't know. Lainey watched Sophie through the kitchen window, her daughter on the dock with her camera, documenting the lake like it was a character in the story. I keep expecting to feel triumphant or vindicated or something. Instead, I just feel tired. That's normal. Sarah's voice held the wisdom of someone who'd fought similar battles. Confronting bullies is exhausting even when you win, especially when you win with compassion instead of cruelty. It's easier to hate people than to understand them. Do you think she'll step down? Honestly? Sarah paused. I think she's terrified. And terrified people either surrender or burn everything down. We'll know which kind she is soon enough. After they hung up, Lainey found herself drawn to Rose's paintings, studying them with new attention. Her grandmother had captured the lake in every season, every mood, summer storms and winter ice, spring renewal and autumn decay. But in every painting, no matter how dark the sky or rough the water, there was light somewhere, a break in the clouds, a reflection on the surface, hope hiding in the composition. Emma showed up around noon with Zoe and lunch, turkey sandwiches and chips, and the kind of easy company that didn't require conversation. They ate on the porch while Zoe sketched, her teenager's hands already showing real talent. The girl had been quiet since the meeting, processing everything she'd witnessed. Finally, she looked up from her sketchbook. Is it always like that? Fighting for what's right? All messy and complicated? Always, Emma said. Nothing worth doing is clean. But you still do it? Zoe's question held the uncertainty of someone just beginning to understand how hard being an adult actually was. We do it because not doing it is worse. Emma glanced at Lainey. Your mom and Ms. Hutchinson, we're teaching you something your teachers never will. That sometimes being good means being uncomfortable. That real courage looks a lot like fear. That standing up costs something, but staying silent costs more. Zoe absorbed this, then went back to her sketching. Later, when Lainey looked at what she'd drawn, she found a portrait of herself she barely recognized. Strong jaw, clear eyes, shoulders back. The person she was becoming instead of who she'd been. The first day passed, then the second. Victoria's deadline approached like a countdown to detonation. Lainey tried to work on the cabin, fixing things that Rose had let slide in her final years. Loose boards, peeling paint, small repairs that kept her hands busy while her mind spun through scenarios and consequences. What if Victoria refused to step down? What if she went to court and dragged this out for years? What if the legal fees bankrupted everyone, including Lainey? Sophie found her on the third morning sitting on the dock, staring at the water like it might offer answers. The lake was glass smooth, reflecting clouds and trees so perfectly you couldn't tell where reality ended and reflection began. You're spiraling, Sophie said, sitting beside her. Is it that obvious? Mom, I've watched you spiral my entire life, usually over things that didn't matter. Dad's opinion, your friend's judgment, whether the pot roast was perfect. Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. This is the first time I've seen you spiral over something that actually matters. That's progress. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like I'm about to ruin everything, or save everything. Sophie bumped her shoulder against Lainey's. You gave Victoria a choice. Whatever she does with it is on her, not you. You can't control her response. Only your actions. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. She just forgot to apply her own lessons. Sophie stood, offered her hand to pull Lainey up. Come on, Grace called. Emergency women's circle tonight. They want you there. The gathering that evening felt different from the others. More somber, the air thick with anticipation. Women who'd been at the HOA meeting filled Diane's cabin, some sitting, others standing, all waiting for something they couldn't quite name. Grace presided with her usual no-nonsense authority, but even she seemed uncertain about what came next. "Victoria's deadline expires at 7 tonight," Grace said. "Sarah's at her office waiting. We're here because whatever happens, we need to be together. Remind each other why we're doing this." The story started then, unprompted. Women sharing not just Victoria's harassment, but their own experiences with being made small. Marriages that had shrunk them, bosses who'd dismissed them, mothers and fathers who'd taught them to apologize for existing. The testimonies wove together into something larger than any individual experience. A collective understanding that the fight against Victoria was really a fight against every force that told women they were too much or not enough, too loud or too quiet, too ambitious or not driven enough. Never just right, never just allowed to be. Lainey listened and felt her own story dissolving into the larger narrative. She wasn't unique, wasn't special. She was just one of countless women who'd been taught to shrink, and was finally, painfully, learning to expand back to her original size. At 6:45, Sarah called. "I'm coming to you. Victoria wants to meet. All of us, at the cabin in 30 minutes. She says she has an answer." The cabin, Lainey's sanctuary. The space that had felt safe was about to become a battlefield. She looked around at the women gathered in Diane's living room, their faces showing the same mixture of hope and dread she felt in her own chest. "We'll all go," Grace said. "She doesn't get to do this alone. Whatever happens, we're witnesses." They made a procession through the dusky woods, 20 women walking single file along the path to Lainey's cabin. It felt ceremonial somehow, significant, like they were marching toward something that would define everything that came after. The sun was setting through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, that brief window when the world looked almost holy. At the cabin, they arranged themselves on the porch and in the yard, a semicircle of silent witnesses. Lainey stood at the center, feeling the weight of their presence at her back. Sophie positioned herself with her camera, documenting everything. The light was perfect for filming, that magic hour cinematographers prayed for. Victoria arrived at precisely 7:15, not in her BMW, but in an older Honda that looked borrowed. She walked slowly, like every step required decision. No power suit tonight, just jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. Her hair hung loose around her face, and her makeup couldn't quite hide that she'd been crying. Behind her, at a distance, came Rebecca, and to everyone's surprise, a third woman, older, maybe late 70s, distinguished in the way some people wear age like achievement. "Catherine Park," she introduced herself. "I'm a therapist specializing in trauma and grief. Victoria asked me to be here." The configuration was unexpected. Lainey had braced for lawyers and threats, for Bradford Sterling and his briefcase full of intimidation. Instead, she got a broken woman, a concerned sister, and a therapist. The dissonance was disorienting. "Thank you for meeting with me." Victoria's voice was nothing like it had been at the HOA meeting. No authority, no armor, just exhaustion. "I've spent the last 48 hours talking to Catherine, and to Rebecca, and to my husband Richard, who I haven't really talked to in years." The words came slow, like each one cost something. "I need to tell you all a story. About my daughter, about what really happened." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Melissa didn't die in an accident. Victoria's voice cracked but held. She died because she'd been drinking, swimming drunk, alone, at night, because she was so unhappy she didn't care if she lived or died. And she was unhappy because I spent her entire life trying to make her perfect, trying to control every aspect of her existence, because my father controlled mine, and I didn't know any other way to love. Tears ran down Victoria's face now, unchecked. I found her diary afterward, read about how much she hated me, how suffocated she felt, how she'd rather die than disappoint me one more time. And instead of getting help, instead of facing what I'd done, I blamed the lake, blamed the old cabins, blamed everyone except myself. She looked directly at Lainey. "You were right at the meeting. I was trying to control everyone else because I couldn't control my own pain. Couldn't face that I killed my daughter with expectations she could never meet. So I became the thing I hated most. I became my father. Catherine stepped forward slightly, a gentle presence. Victoria is entering intensive treatment, starting tomorrow. Inpatient for 30 days, then ongoing therapy. She's also stepping down as HOA president effective immediately. And the special assessment? Grace's question was quiet but firm. Rescinded. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Turns out I was embezzling funds to pay for private investigators, trying to find dirt on anyone who challenged me. The assessment was to cover what I'd stolen. Sarah will have full documentation by tomorrow. I'll be making restitution. What about everyone you forced out? Eleanor's voice came from the back of the crowd. The people who lost their homes because of you? I can't undo that. Victoria's shoulders sagged. I can't give back years or homes or peace of mind. But I'm setting up a fund, from the sale of my house, to compensate everyone I harmed. It won't be enough. Nothing will be enough. But it's what I can do. Lainey felt the women around her processing this. Felt the collective confusion of getting not a fight, but a surrender. Not defiance, but accountability. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like watching someone come apart. Why? Lainey heard herself ask. Why now? Why not fight? Victoria met her eyes, and in them, Lainey saw something she recognized. The exhaustion of living a lie. The relief of finally being seen. Because I'm tired, Mrs. Hutchinson. So tired of pretending to be strong when I'm broken. Of hurting people because I'm hurt. Catherine helped me understand that my father taught me control equals love. But it doesn't. Control is just fear with authority. Real love requires letting go. She pulled an envelope from her pocket. This is my formal resignation. And this, another envelope, is a recommendation that you be appointed to the HOA board. Not as president, just as a voice. Someone who actually cares about community instead of control. Lainey took the envelopes with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know if there were words for this moment when justice met mercy, and neither one felt simple. I don't expect forgiveness, Victoria continued. Don't deserve it, but I'm asking for something harder. I'm asking you all to let me try to be better, to stay in this community and face what I've done instead of running away, to let me earn back humanity one day at a time. The silence stretched. Then Linda spoke, her voice steady. I was forced to endure your homophobia for 2 years. You made me feel ashamed of who I love. You don't get to stay unless you do the work, real work, not performance. I will. Victoria's voice was small but sincere. You destroyed my credit, Amy Wilson said. Made me take loans I couldn't afford. You pay that back with interest. I will. One by one, the women spoke, laying out terms, demanding accountability. Not with cruelty, but with the firmness of people who'd been hurt and wouldn't be hurt again. Victoria listened to all of it, took notes in shaking handwriting, agreed to everything. Finally, Grace looked at Lainey. You're the one holding the cards. What do you say? Lainey thought about Rose, about the paintings on the cabin walls that always included light even in darkness, about legacy being not what you leave behind, but how you teach people to treat each other. About how breaking cycles required believing people could change. I say we give her the chance she never gave anyone else. Lainey's voice was stronger than she expected. But on our terms. Transparent accounting, community oversight, one violation and she's out permanently. No second chances after this second chance. Agreed, Victoria whispered. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't done the work. You've just committed to starting. Catherine stepped forward again. If I may, I'd like to propose something. Community healing circles. Not just for Victoria, but for everyone harmed. Processing trauma together often helps more than individual therapy. I'd be willing to facilitate, no charge. The murmur that went through the gathered women sounded like assent. Like possibility. Like the first breath after holding your breath so long, you forgot you were doing it. The meeting dispersed slowly. Women drifting away in small groups, processing, discussing, beginning the work of deciding whether to believe in redemption. Victoria left with Rebecca and Catherine, getting into the borrowed car like a prisoner leaving the courthouse. Not free, exactly, but not condemned either. Sophie lowered her camera, her face stunned. Mom, did that really just happen? I think so. Lainey felt disconnected from her own body, floating somewhere above the scene. I think we just chose mercy. Is that what it was? Sophie's question held genuine curiosity. Because it looked more like you gave her enough rope to either climb out or hang herself. Only time will tell which. Maybe that's what mercy is. Lainey sank down onto the porch steps, giving people the space to become who they claim they want to be, even when they don't deserve it. Especially then. Sarah was the last to leave, staying behind after everyone else filtered away into the gathering dark. She sat beside Lainey on the steps, both of them staring out at the lake that had become the center of everything. "You did good work tonight," Sarah said. "Did I?" Lainey's voice came out hollow. "Because I'm not sure if I just helped someone heal or let a predator stay in the henhouse. You set boundaries, made accountability non-negotiable, offered space for change while protecting the community." Sarah's professional assessment steadied something in Lainey's chest. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. It doesn't feel wise, it feels complicated. That's because real justice usually is. Sarah stood, brushed off her jeans. The easy thing would have been to destroy her. You chose the harder thing, to hold space for transformation while maintaining consequences. That takes more courage than revenge ever does. After Sarah left, Lainey and Sophie sat together in the dark. The porch light attracted moths, and the lake whispered against the shore, and somewhere in the woods an owl called to its mate. Normal sounds, the world continuing despite the seismic shift that had just occurred. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Sophie said quietly. "In case I haven't said it enough." "You've said it plenty." Lainey leaned her head on her daughter's shoulder, grateful for the solid presence. "I just hope I made the right call." "You made a call. That's all we can do. Make the best choice we can with what we know, and then deal with whatever comes next." Sophie's wisdom sounded hard-earned. "Besides, you didn't do this alone. You had a whole army of women behind you. That's what made it possible." The observation settled something in Lainey. She had spent so much of her life feeling alone, carrying burdens in isolation, believing that asking for help was admission of failure. But the last few weeks had taught her different. Community wasn't just support. It was strength multiplied. It was courage borrowed and paid forward. It was the difference between surviving and thriving. The days that followed Victoria's resignation moved fast and slow simultaneously. On the surface, life continued. Lainey worked on the cabin, walked the lake, spent time with Sophie before her daughter had to return to New York. But underneath the routine, transformation was happening in ways both visible and invisible. Grace was elected interim HOA president by unanimous vote. Her first act was creating a transition committee to rewrite the bylaws, establishing term limits and financial oversight, and anti-harassment policies with real enforcement mechanisms. Emma joined the board as treasurer, her background in running a business making her perfect for cleaning up the financial mess Victoria had created. Victoria's house sold within a week, bought by a young family with 3 kids who didn't care about its history, just loved the lake view. The money went into an escrow account managed by Sarah, designated for restitution to everyone Victoria had harmed. It wouldn't make anyone whole, but it was something. A start. Victoria herself disappeared into treatment. No one heard from her directly, but Rebecca provided updates. The work was hard. Victoria was resistant and broken and fighting her therapist almost as much as she was fighting herself. But she was showing up, day after day, doing the excruciating work of facing what she'd become and choosing to become something different. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Catherine Park held the first community healing circle. 15 people showed up. Victims of Victoria's harassment, family members affected by the conflict, even Richard Whitmore, Victoria's husband, looking older than his years and grateful for space to process his own complicity in enabling his wife's behavior. They sat in a circle in the community center and took turns speaking truth. Not the polished versions they told strangers, but the raw, messy reality of how they'd been hurt and how they'd survived. Lainey listened more than she spoke, learning that her story was both unique and universal, that everyone carried wounds, that healing required witnessing each other's pain without trying to fix it. "I enabled her because I was afraid," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Afraid if I challenged her, I'd lose her like we lost Melissa. So I let her hurt people rather than risk losing my wife. That makes me complicit in everything she did." The confession hung in the air. Grace reached over and took his hand. "You're here now. That's what matters. Not what you should have done. What you're choosing to do next." Sophie left after 3 weeks, heading back to her job and her life, but promising to return for the summer. Her absence left a hole Lainey felt physically, like a missing limb. But it was different from the emptiness she'd felt after the divorce. That had been loss of identity. This was just missing someone she loved. Temporary separation, not permanent erasure. Alone again, Lainey found herself returning to Rose's paintings. She set up the easel on the screened porch and picked up brushes she hadn't touched in 30 years. Her first attempts were terrible, shaky and uncertain, muscle memory gone rusty from disuse. But she kept at it, painting the lake in morning light, afternoon shadow, evening gold. Emma stopped by one afternoon and found her covered in paint, swearing at a canvas that refused to cooperate. "Your grandmother made it look easy." "It's not." Lainey wiped her hands on a rag already stiff with dried acrylics. "I'm remembering why I gave this up. It's frustrating and difficult, and half the time I want to throw the whole thing in the lake. So why keep doing it? Because I gave up too much of myself over the years?" Lainey studied the painting, seeing both its flaws and its potential. "I need to remember what it feels like to create something just because I want to. Not for anyone else. Just for me." Emma nodded, understanding. "That's what this whole thing has been about, hasn't it? Not the lake or the HOA or even Victoria. It's been about you remembering you're allowed to want things." The observation landed true. Lainey had spent so much of her life in reaction mode, responding to others' needs and demands and expectations, that she'd forgotten she could have desires of her own. Could want things not because they made her a better wife or mother, but simply because they made her happy. A month after Victoria's resignation, Sarah called with news. The quiet title action went through unopposed. Official legal recognition that Lainey owned the water rights, making it public record, ending any future dispute. The license agreement with the HOA was rewritten, signed by the new board, establishing clear terms and fair compensation. "You're official now," Sarah said, the smile evident in her voice. "Owner of one lake, complete with all rights, responsibilities, and headaches therein." "What have I done?" Lainey tried for humor, but heard the real question underneath. She'd wanted justice and gotten it, had wanted her rights recognized and achieved that goal, but now she owned something that came with weight and obligation, and the expectation that she'd be a better steward than Victoria had been. "You've given this community a chance to become what it was supposed to be," Sarah said gently. "Place where people support instead of control, help instead of hurt. That's no small thing." After they hung up, Lainey walked down to the dock and sat where Rose used to sit, her feet dangling above water that legally belonged to her but really belonged to itself. She thought about legacy and what it meant to inherit not just property but responsibility. Rose had protected these water rights for 50 years, held them in trust, and passed them to her granddaughter, not as wealth but as calling. The sun was setting, painting the lake in shades of orange and gold that would be impossible to capture and paint, but she'd try anyway tomorrow. The water reflected clouds and trees and the darkening sky, that perfect doubling that made you question which version was real and which was just illusion. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grace. "Circle meeting tomorrow night. Would love to see you there." Another text, this one from Emma. "Zoe wants to know if you teach her to paint. Says you're the first adult who treats her art seriously." A third text from Catherine Park. "Victoria completed her first month of treatment. Made significant progress. Would like to write you a letter, if you're willing to receive it." Lainey stared at that last message for a long moment. Was she willing? To read Victoria's words, to engage with her rehabilitation, to be part of her healing journey? The easy answer was no. She owed Victoria nothing, had already given her more grace than the woman deserved. But Rose's voice echoed in her memory. Real stewardship means protecting everyone, not just people you like. Means holding space for transformation even when it's uncomfortable. Means believing change is possible, because the alternative is accepting nothing ever gets better. She texted back to Catherine, "I'm willing." The letter arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by Rebecca. Lainey almost didn't open it, letting it sit on the kitchen table for hours while she did other things, cleaned and cooked and avoided the envelope like it might contain something explosive. Finally, in the evening, with tea and courage gathered, she broke the seal. The letter was 5 pages, handwritten, Victoria's usually perfect penmanship shaky and uncertain. It started with apology. but not the performative kind. Raw acknowledgement of harm done, specific instances, names of people hurt. Victoria cataloged her sins with the thoroughness of someone doing penance, not seeking absolution, but stating facts that needed stating. Then it shifted. Victoria wrote about her father, about control learned so young it felt like love, about Melissa and the weight of expectations that crushed instead of elevated, about 12 years of displacing grief onto community because facing it directly felt impossible, about finally, in therapy, learning to sit with pain instead of weaponizing it. The ending made Lainey's throat tight. "I don't expect forgiveness," Victoria wrote. "Don't deserve your grace or anyone's, but I need you to know that what you did, giving me choice instead of just destroying me, it saved my life. Not metaphorically, literally. I had planned to kill myself if the meeting went the way I expected. Had pills saved, notes written. You choosing mercy meant I had to choose living. Had to face what I'd become and decide who I wanted to be instead. I'm angry at you for that, honestly. It would have been easier to die a villain than live trying to become something better. But I'm grateful too. More grateful than I have words for. I don't know if I'll succeed in changing. Don't know if people can really transform or if we're all just prisoners of our worst selves forever. But I'm trying. Every day I wake up and try. That's your doing. Your mercy made space for my rehabilitation. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift, even though I know I never will be. Thank you. And I'm sorry. Those words don't cover it, but they're all I have." Lainey read the letter twice, tears blurring the words the second time through. She thought about Sophie's question from weeks ago. Had she given Victoria rope to climb with or hang herself? Time would tell, but maybe that was the point. Time, space, opportunity. The things no one had given Victoria as a child. The things she'd refused to give Melissa. The things that made transformation possible. She folded the letter carefully and put it in Rose's wooden box, alongside the water rights documents and the cassette tape and all the other inheritances that mattered. Then she sat down and wrote a response. Not long, not detailed, just acknowledgement. "I received your letter. I believe change is possible because I'm living proof of it. 6 months ago, I was a woman who'd forgotten her own name. Today, I own a lake and remember who I am. That transformation happened because people gave me space to become myself again. I'm giving you that same space. Don't waste it." She signed it not as Elaine Hutchinson or Mrs. Hutchinson, but simply as Lainey, the name Rose had called her, the name she was learning to claim. The next women's circle felt different. Lighter somehow, like collective weight had lifted. They gathered at the cabin this time, Lainey's offer, her porch finally ready to hold community. Grace brought wine, Diane brought cookies, Emma and Zoe brought laughter. Linda and Rachel brought hope. They sat in mismatched chairs and watched the lake turn colors as the sun set, told stories, planned the summer solstice celebration Grace wanted to organize, discussed the community garden and the beach cleanup and all the small projects that built neighborhood into something bigger. At one point, Eleanor spoke. She'd been quiet most of the evening, the oldest woman there, someone who'd lost her home and had every right to bitterness. "I've been thinking about Victoria," she said, "about second chances. I don't know if I can forgive her for what she took from me, but I think I can let go of needing her to suffer. That's not forgiveness, just release. Is that enough?" "It's everything," Grace said quietly. "Letting go of needing others to hurt doesn't mean accepting what they did. Just means you're not letting their damage continue defining your life." The women nodded, understanding settling around the circle like a blessing. They sat together until stars appeared, until the lake turned black and reflective, until mosquitoes drove them inside for more wine and stories that stretched late into the night. This was what Rose had wanted. Lainey understood it now with perfect clarity. Not property or power or control, just women gathering in the dark, reminding each other they weren't alone, supporting each other, witnessing each other, building something that looked like family even when blood didn't bind it. Later, alone in the cabin with the sound of the lake whispering through open windows, Lainey felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness yet, but contentment, purpose, the sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She thought about David, about the marriage that had ended and the life she'd left behind. Felt nothing. No anger, no regret. Just the neutral acknowledgement that some chapters close so others can begin. He was someone she used to know. She was someone she used to be. Both versions gone now, transformed into whatever came next. Her phone lit up with a text from Sophie. "How's the revolution going?" Lainey smiled and typed back, quietly. "Turns out real change doesn't look like war. It looks like women gathering on porches. Like second chances and hard conversations. Like believing people can be better than their worst moments." The response came quickly. "That's the story I want to tell. When can I come back and film more? Summer. Bring your camera and your courage. We're building something worth documenting." Lainey set down her phone and walked out onto the dock. Her dock, on her lake, under her stars. The inheritance Rose had left was paying dividends she was only beginning to understand. Not money or property, but wisdom. The knowledge that power used for protection instead of control could heal instead of harm. That mercy wasn't weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. That transformation required believing it was possible even when every instinct said people never changed. Victoria might fail, might slip back into old patterns, might prove that rehabilitation was fantasy and leopards never change their spots. But she might not. Might do the work and become living proof that people contain multitudes, that our worst selves weren't our only selves. And either way, Lainey had done what Rose would have wanted, had protected the lake and the community, and even the woman who'd tried to destroy both. Had chosen to be a steward instead of a tyrant, had broken the cycle. The water lapped against the dock pilings, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Somewhere on the far shore, a light went on in what used to be Victoria's mansion, the new family settling into their evening routine. The lake held them all, reflected all their lives without judgment. Lainey stood in the darkness and felt herself expanding to fill space she'd spent decades trying not to occupy, taking up room, mattering, being visible not as someone's wife or mother or granddaughter but as herself, completely, unapologetically, finally herself. The revolution was quiet, but it was real, and it was just beginning. Summer arrived at Clearwater Lake the way it always had, slow and golden, transforming the landscape from possibility into promise. 3 months had passed since Victoria's resignation. 3 months that felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Lainey stood on the dock in early morning light, coffee steaming in her hands, watching mist rise off the water like the lake was breathing. The ritual had become sacred. This quiet communion with the water that was hers, but also belonged to no one, property rights notwithstanding. The cabin behind her bore marks of transformation. Fresh paint in the same faded blue Rose had chosen, but knew enough to catch the light differently. The porch she'd rebuilt with Emma's help, learning to use tools her ex-husband had always insisted she couldn't master. Inside, her paintings lined the walls beside Rose's, a dialogue between generations about light and water and what home meant when you finally let yourself claim it. Today was significant. The dedication of Heart of the Lake Island, the project that had consumed the community for 3 months. The small island Rose and Henry had purchased separately, kept secret, left to Lainey with the instruction that it become something bigger than private property. A gathering place, a sanctuary, proof that land could be held in trust for everyone instead of hoarded by someone. Sophie had arrived yesterday from New York, bringing Ben, who'd driven up from Boston. Lainey's children, together at the lake for the first time since they were kids, since before the divorce had fractured the family into fragments that were only now beginning to reassemble into something different but whole. They'd stayed up late on the porch, the 3 of them, talking in ways they never had when David was alive in the marriage. Honest, raw, real. "Mom, you're different here," Sophie had said, her filmmaker's eye seeing what her daughter's heart already knew. Not just happier, more yourself. Like you finally remembered who you were supposed to be. Ben had nodded agreement. "Dad called me last month, asked about you, wanted to know if you were seeing anyone. I told him that wasn't the question he should be asking. What should he ask? If you were okay. If you'd found what you were looking for." Ben's voice held something Lainey couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe. Or respect. You have, haven't you? Found it. Lainey had looked out at the dark lake, at the island waiting for tomorrow's ceremony. I found something better than okay. I found purpose, community, myself. Those things were always here. I just couldn't see them while I was busy being someone else. Now in the fresh morning, Lainey heard footsteps on the dock behind her. Grace appeared, already dressed for the day, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee like she'd known Lainey would be here. Couldn't sleep either. Grace settled beside her with the ease of someone who'd claimed this spot through repetition. Too excited or too nervous? Haven't decided which. Both! Lainey accepted the fresh coffee gratefully. What if no one comes? What if this whole thing is just us fooling ourselves that we've built something that matters? Grace's laugh was low and knowing. Honey, I've been alive 70 years. Learned that things that matter always feel fragile right before they become permanent. That vulnerability is how you know it's real. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lake wake up. A blue heron picked its way through the shallows. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker announced territorial claims with rhythmic insistence, the world continuing its ancient patterns, while humans tried to make meaning out of mortality and property lines. Victoria's coming today, Grace said finally. Called Rebecca yesterday, asked permission to attend. Wanted me to ask you directly if you're okay with that. Lainey felt something complex move through her chest. Victoria had been out of treatment for 6 weeks now, living in a small rental on the far side of the lake, working part-time at the community center teaching job search skills. Lainey had seen her from a distance a few times, watched her walk with her head down, shoulders curved inward like she was trying to take up less space. The transformation from tyrant to penitent had been complete and somehow harder to witness than the original cruelty. She can come, Lainey said. This is community space. She's part of the community. That's the whole point. Even after everything? Especially after everything. Lainey watched the heron strike, coming up with a fish that flashed silver in early light. We don't get to decide who deserves second chances based on whether they've earned them. We either believe in transformation, or we don't. I'm choosing to believe. Grace nodded slowly. You're more like Rose every day. She always said the hardest part of love was loving people while they learned to love themselves. The hours before the ceremony passed in controlled chaos. Tables set up on the island, ferried over by boat, food arriving in waves, potluck offerings from a community learning to feed itself. Emma and Zoe stringing lights, solar-powered, that would glow when evening came. Diane arranging flowers in mason jars, simple and beautiful. Sarah reviewing the legal documents one final time, making sure every detail was perfect. Lainey found herself in constant motion, helping where she could, staying out of the way when competence didn't require her presence. She was learning the difference between leading and controlling, between being essential and being present. The distinction mattered more than she'd understood 6 months ago. By noon, boats began arriving. Residents shuttling across water that belonged to everyone and no one. Families with children who shrieked with delight at the adventure. Elderly couples moving slowly but determinedly. Young people bringing energy and hope. The turnout exceeded every expectation. 200 people, maybe more, gathering on an island that could barely hold them all but would have to because this moment required witness. Julia Montgomery showed up with her camera crew from the local news. The story had caught regional attention. This small community choosing healing over vengeance, building sanctuary instead of fortress. National outlets had called, but Lainey had declined those interviews. This wasn't about fame, just about doing the work and hoping it mattered. Eleanor Hart arrived with her family, 3 generations of people she'd thought she'd lost. When Victoria forced her from her home 8 years ago, her grandchildren ran ahead, exploring the island with the fearlessness of youth. Eleanor caught Lainey's eye and smiled, a complicated expression that held pain and forgiveness in equal measure. I never thought I'd set foot on this lake again, Eleanor said when they stood together near the new pavilion Emma and Miguel had built. Never thought I'd want to. But this, she gestured to the island, the people, the transformation. This is something different, something worth coming back for. Richard Whitmore arrived alone, looking older than his 64 years, the weight of complicity visible in every line of his face. He'd filed for divorce 3 weeks ago, a decision he'd told the healing circle was necessary for both of them to become who they needed to be, without the weight of shared history crushing them flat. Rebecca came next, bringing Catherine Park, who'd become unofficial community therapist, leading circles twice a month now for anyone who wanted to do the hard work of processing trauma and choosing growth. The two women had become friends through this process, united by love for someone damaged and determination to help her heal. Then, just before the ceremony was set to begin, Victoria appeared. She came by kayak, paddling herself across the water with uncertain strokes, arriving last like she knew she didn't deserve to arrive at all. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and more vulnerable. She didn't approach the crowd, just found a spot at the far edge, standing alone like she was ready to leave if anyone asked. Grace saw her first, walked over without hesitation, said something Lainey couldn't hear but could read in body language. Grace's hand on Victoria's arm, Victoria's shoulders dropping slightly. Permission granted to occupy space, tentative as it was. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock, with Grace speaking, her voice carrying across water and wood and collective hope. We gather today to dedicate Heart of the Lake Island to community, to conservation, to the radical idea that some things should belong to everyone. Rose and Henry Hutchinson protected this land for 50 years, held it in trust, passed it to Rose's granddaughter, who honored their vision by making it real. She gestured to Lainey. "Come tell them what we're doing here." Lainey stepped forward and felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes. Public speaking had never been her strength. She'd spent decades avoiding attention, preferring to fade into backgrounds and let others shine. But that Lainey was gone, replaced by someone who understood that visibility wasn't vanity. Sometimes it was responsibility. My grandmother Rose left me more than property. She left me a question. What does it mean to own something? To have power? To hold rights that others don't? Her voice steadied as she spoke. I spent 3 months thinking ownership meant control, that having legal rights meant deciding who got access and who didn't, that power was about making rules and enforcing them. She paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar, friends and neighbors, and even former enemies. But Rose taught me different. Taught that real ownership is stewardship, that true power is protection, that the best use of rights is making sure everyone has them. This island, she gestured to the land beneath their feet, was purchased by my grandparents to prevent development, to keep something wild and beautiful from being carved into lots and sold to the highest bidder. They could have kept it private, built a mansion here, made it a monument to themselves. Instead, they left instructions that it become public trust, proof that some things matter more than profit. The crowd listened with the attention people give to words that confirmed something they already believed, but had been afraid to speak. Lainey felt Sophie filming, felt her daughter documenting this moment for whatever story it would become. So today we dedicate this space to community, to the idea that we're better together than alone, that healing requires witness, that transformation is possible when we create space for it. She looked directly at Victoria then, saw the other woman's eyes go wide with surprise, and something that might have been gratitude. This island welcomes everyone. No exceptions, no exclusions, no conditions except respect for the land and each other. Sarah stepped forward then with the legal documents, reading the trust language that made it official. Land held in perpetuity for public use, managed by community board, protected from development, from private sale, from anyone who thought ownership meant control. The words had power, legal force, but also something deeper. Commitment made public, witnessed, real. Catherine spoke next about healing, about how space and nature and community could help people do the hard work of becoming better versions of themselves. Her words were clinical but kind, professional but personal. She'd seen what trauma did to people, also what recovery looked like when conditions were right. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor asked to speak. Walked to the front with determination despite her 82 years. "I lost my home to cruelty," she said simply. "Spent 8 years bitter and broken, believing some people were just evil and nothing could change that." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, knowing what was coming. But being here today, seeing this community choose something different, I'm learning that holding on to hate hurts me more than it hurts anyone else. She looked at Victoria, who was crying silently at the edge of the gathering. "I don't forgive you," she said directly. "Maybe I never will, but I release you. Stop letting your damage define my life. That's not forgiveness, just freedom. Mine, not yours." The distinction landed like truth often does, complicated and complete. Victoria nodded once, acknowledgement without expectation. The moment stretched, heavy with implications, then broke as people began moving, exploring. The ceremony concluded, but the gathering continuing. Children found the nature trail immediately, running ahead of parents who called warnings that went unheeded. Couples discovered the meditation pavilion, sitting together in companionable silence. Artists gravitated toward the small studio space where easels stood ready. Rose's vision of creating beauty becoming perpetual invitation. Teenagers found the swimming dock, testing water temperature with toes and laughter. Lainey walked the perimeter, watching people claim space she'd given them. Pride mixed with something like grief. This was what Rose had wanted, what Henry had protected, what she'd inherited and multiplied, but also what she was releasing. The island didn't belong to her anymore, belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to the future more than the present. She found Victoria sitting alone near the memorial garden, the section they'd created for Melissa and others lost too soon. The younger woman was staring at the stone marker like it might speak, tears running unchecked down her face. Lainey sat beside her uninvited. Beautiful spot. Victoria flinched but didn't leave. She would have hated this, you know. Melissa, all the fuss, the attention. She just wanted to be normal, to not have to be perfect. I spent her entire life trying to make her into something she wasn't. You were trying to protect her. Victoria's laugh was bitter. I was trying to control her. There's a difference. Protection gives freedom. Control takes it away. I gave her nothing but expectations she could never meet. They sat in silence, the weight of dead daughters and living regrets pressing down like weather. Finally, Victoria spoke again, voice raw. "I don't expect your forgiveness. Don't deserve this." She gestured to the island, the community, the second chance. "But I need you to know, what you did, giving me choice instead of destruction, it's the only reason I'm alive. I had pills saved, notes written, was going to disappear into the lake like Melissa did. You choosing mercy meant I had to choose living." Lainey felt something crack in her chest. Victoria's life, fragile as glass, held together by one woman's decision to believe transformation was possible. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but also right somehow. Proof that mercy wasn't weakness, but the hardest form of strength. "I'm glad you're still here," Lainey said simply. "Glad you're doing the work. Keep doing it. Not for me, for yourself, for the person Melissa needed you to be and the person you can still become." Victoria nodded, unable to speak. They sat together watching people circulate through the memorial garden, reading names, leaving flowers, each visitor carrying their own weight of loss and learning to set it down. The afternoon dissolved into evening, the kind of summer twilight that seems to last forever. Food appeared on tables, potluck abundance that spoke to community abundance. Diane's cookies, Grace's tamales, Emma's Korean barbecue, casseroles and salads and dishes from cultures and traditions that blended into something uniquely theirs. People ate and talked and laughed with the ease of people who'd chosen each other as family. Grace found Lainey as the sun touched the horizon. "There's someone I want you to meet." She brought forward a man about Lainey's age, weathered and comfortable in his skin. "This is Miguel Santos. He did most of the construction on the pavilion." "Miguel," Lainey Hutchinson. The man's handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "Your grandmother hired me 20 years ago to fix her dock, paid me in fish and stories about this lake before development. I'm honored to help finish her vision." They talked for a few minutes, easy conversation that suggested future conversations might follow. When he moved away, Grace raised an eyebrow meaningfully. "He's single. Good man, just saying." Lainey laughed. "I'm not looking." You never are when you find what you need. Grace's wisdom came from lived experience. Just keep yourself open. Life has a way of surprising us when we stop controlling outcomes. As darkness fell, the solar lights clicked on, transforming the island into something magical. strings of light reflecting in water, creating doubled beauty that made people pause and breathe and remember why they'd fought for this. Music started, someone's guitar, voices joining in rough harmony, old songs, folk songs, tunes that didn't require perfection, just participation. Sophie found Lainey sitting on the dock, legs dangling over water. Ben joined them, the three of them side by side like when they were young, before life got complicated. "This is really something, Mom," Ben said. "You built this." "We built it," Lainey corrected. "Community built it. I just held space for it to happen." "That's leadership," Sophie said. "Knowing when to step back, when to trust other people, when to believe in something bigger than yourself." They watched the party continue. Watched Victoria talk tentatively with Rebecca. Watched Grace and Miguel dance with the awkwardness of people remembering how after years of not trying. Watched Diane teach Zoe to waltz, the generations bridging through movement and music. Watched children chase fireflies while parents relaxed, trusting that community meant shared responsibility for everyone's safety. "I'm thinking about moving back," Sophie said suddenly, "from New York, at least for a while. Do documentary work from here. Tell stories about small communities doing big things." Her voice held uncertainty. "Would that be weird, living near you?" Lainey felt tears prick her eyes. "I'd love that, but only if it's what you want, not what you think I need." "It's what I want," Sophie's voice firmed. "I spent years running from this place, from childhood, from who I used to be. But watching you remember yourself, it makes me want to remember too. Before I became the person I thought I should be." Ben nodded. "I'm staying in Boston, but I'll visit more. Actually visit, not just show up out of obligation." His voice went quiet. "I'm sorry, Mom, for not seeing what you were going through, for letting Dad define the narrative, for not being there when you needed us." "You're here now." Lainey put her arms around both her children, pulled them close in a way she hadn't dared in years. "That's what matters. Not what we should have done. What we're choosing now." The party continued until past midnight. People reluctant to leave, wanting to stretch the evening into proof that magic was real and transformation possible. Finally, slowly, boats began ferrying people back to shore. Promises to return, commitments to maintain this space, gratitude spoken and implied. Victoria was among the last to leave, paddling her kayak into darkness with only a headlamp for guide. Before she went, she approached Lainey one final time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the space, for the chance, for believing I could be better than my worst self." "Don't thank me yet." Lainey's voice was gentle but firm. "Show me. Show all of us. One day at a time, one choice at a time. That's how transformation works." Victoria nodded and disappeared into the night, a small figure on dark water, paddling toward a future none of them could predict, but all of them were invested in hoping existed. When everyone had gone, Lainey stood alone on the island, her island that wasn't hers anymore, the inheritance she'd accepted and immediately given away. Sophie and Ben had returned to the cabin to sleep, exhausted and happy. Grace and Diane and Emma and all the others had gone home to their own lives, carrying this evening with them like light in a jar. The lake whispered against the shore. The light still glowed, transforming the space into something otherworldly. Lainey walked through the memorial garden, reading names in the dim light. Melissa Whitmore, Eleanor's husband Thomas, Grace's husband Carlos, Emma's mother, all the people this community carried, remembered, honored by continuing to live and build and choose hope over despair. She found herself at Rose's memorial stone, placed there by Grace without asking permission. Rose Hutchinson, it read, protector of lakes and hearts. The epitaph was perfect. Rose had protected both with equal fierceness, understanding that landscapes and people required the same kind of care, attention without control, love without conditions, space to become without dictating what that becoming should look like. "Thank you," Lainey whispered to the stone, to the ghost, to the legacy that had saved her life more surely than CPR ever could. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for leaving me tools when I was ready to use them, for believing I'd fight when I didn't know I could." The wind picked up, moving through trees with sound like breath. In it, Lainey imagined she heard Rose's voice, not words exactly, just presence, approval, love that transcended death because it had always been about more than one person's affection. It had been about teaching someone to love themselves. Lainey stayed on the island until dawn began painting the eastern sky. Watch the transformation from dark to light, the gradual revelation that happened every morning whether anyone witnessed it or not, the world continuing its patient work of becoming. When she finally paddled back to shore, the cabin waited. Her cabin, in a way it hadn't been when she'd arrived 6 months ago. Then it had been Rose's space, borrowed and uncertain. Now it was hers, filled with her paintings and her furniture and her life built from fragments of who she'd been and visions of who she was becoming. Sophie was awake, making coffee, when Lainey walked in. "You stayed all night?" "Couldn't leave." Lainey accepted the mug gratefully. "Felt like I needed to bear witness, make sure it was real and not just beautiful dream." "It's real, Mom." Sophie gestured to her laptop where she'd been editing footage. "I've got hours of documentation, proof that communities can choose healing, that mercy isn't naivete, that transformation is possible when we create space for it." "What will you do with it?" "Tell the story." Sophie's eyes held determination inherited from grandmother and mother both. "Not just about you or Victoria or this lake. About what's possible when people remember they're responsible for each other. When they choose connection over isolation. When they believe change is real." The days that followed settled into new routine. Lainey taught art classes on the island twice a week, adults and children learning to see light and capture it on canvas. Emma brought Zoe for private lessons, the girl's talent blooming under attention and encouragement. Miguel showed up to fix things that needed fixing, then stayed for coffee and conversation that felt like the beginning of something neither of them was rushing to define. Grace organized monthly community dinners, everyone contributing, no one hosting, the work distributed so no one burned out carrying it alone. Diane started a book club that met on the island, reading under trees, discussing stories while real life happened around them. Catherine continued healing circles, the attendance growing as more people felt safe enough to bring their damage into light. Victoria showed up faithfully, doing the work publicly and privately. She'd taken a job at the community center teaching resume writing and job search skills, helping people rebuild after loss. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but the sincerity was real. She came to healing circles and said little, but listened deeply. She volunteered for island maintenance, showing up to pull weeds and repair trails without fanfare or expectation of praise. Slowly, incrementally, people began treating her like person instead of punishment, offering smiles instead of glares, including her in conversations instead of going silent when she approached. The rehabilitation was fragile and incomplete, but it was happening. Proof that communities could hold space for transformation if they chose to. 3 months after the dedication, Sarah called with news. The Conservation Trust is officially recognized by the state. Heart of the Lake Island is protected in perpetuity. Can't be sold, can't be developed, can't be turned into anything except what it is. You did it, Lainey. You created something that will outlive all of us. The achievement felt both enormous and natural. Of course the island was protected. Of course the community had rallied. Of course the legal structures had held. Because that's what happened when enough people wanted the same thing badly enough to work for it. Sophie's documentary premiered at a regional film festival that fall. Lainey attended with Grace and Emma and half the community, watching their lives played back in Sophie's artistic vision. The film didn't shy away from complexity, showed Victoria's cruelty and her collapse, Eleanor's pain and her release, Lainey's transformation from invisible to essential, the whole messy, beautiful process of people choosing to be better than their worst instincts. The audience gave it a standing ovation. Distribution offers came immediately. Sophie accepted one that would bring the story to streaming audiences nationwide. The film would be called The Inheritance, and it would tell the world that small communities could model transformation that larger society desperately needed to learn. That winter, Lainey's first winter alone in the cabin, felt different from the arrival 6 months previous. Then she'd been running from. Now she was running toward. The distinction mattered more than geography ever could. She painted through the dark months, capturing ice and snow and the particular quality of light in January that made everything sharp and clear. Sarah became a regular visitor, stopping by for coffee and legal consultations that increasingly became just friendship. Two women who'd both rebuilt themselves from rubble, finding kinship and shared experience. Miguel showed up to insulate pipes and stayed for dinner, the friendship deepening into something that looked like romance, but moved at the pace of people who'd learned not to rush healing. Victoria sent a letter at Christmas, not asking for anything, just offering update. She'd completed 9 months of therapy, was considering going back to school, maybe counseling degree, maybe something that would let her help others the way Catherine had helped her. Richard had moved away, but they talked occasionally. The divorce final, but the relationship settling into something like friendship. She was learning, she wrote, what it meant to be alone without being lonely, to take up appropriate space instead of too much or too little, to forgive herself for being human, which was harder than forgiving anyone else. I don't know if I'll ever be whole, the letter concluded, but I'm learning that broken people can still be useful, can still contribute, can still matter. Thank you for teaching me that, for not giving up on possibility when giving up would have been easier. I hope someday to make you proud, but until then, I'm trying to make myself proud, one day at a time. Lainey folded the letter carefully and added it to Rose's box. The collection of inheritances growing, proof that legacy was living thing that continued creating ripples long after the stone hit water. Spring came again, the cycle completing and beginning simultaneously. 1 year since Lainey had arrived broken and lost. 1 year since Rose's death had paradoxically given her life back. The lake thawed, ice retreating to reveal water that looked new but was ancient, containing all the history and none of the grudges. The community gathered for spring cleanup, picking up winter's debris from the island, preparing for another season of shared space. Children older now, more confident, couples more committed or differently configured. Victoria present but peripheral, earning her place back molecule by molecule through sustained effort and humble presence. Lainey stood on the dock afterward, watching sunset in colors that begged to be painted. Sophie beside her, now living in a small house she'd rented in town. Ben was visiting for the weekend, bringing a girlfriend he seemed serious about. Her children, grown and separate, but choosing proximity. Choosing family not out of obligation, but genuine desire for connection. Are you happy, Mom? Sophie's question came quietly. Lainey considered. Happy felt too small for what she felt. Too simple. I'm content. I'm purposeful. I'm myself. Those things feel better than happiness, more solid, more real. That's what inheritance really means, isn't it? Sophie's filmmaker brain always finding the story, not money or property, but permission to become who you were always meant to be. Rose left you that. Now you're passing it on to everyone else. The observation landed true. Legacy wasn't property that passed from dead hands to living. It was wisdom that multiplied through action. Rose's belief in community and stewardship passed to Lainey, passed to Sophie and Ben, and every person who touched this lake and been changed by the idea that some things mattered more than individual gain. The summer solstice celebration that year felt like homecoming. Same island, same community, but deeper somehow, more rooted. People brought stories of how the past year had changed them. Eleanor talked about letting go of bitterness and reclaiming joy. Emma about teaching Zoe that strength came in many forms. Grace about finding love at 70 and realizing it was never too late for anything except dying. Victoria attended but didn't speak, still earning her way back into full participation. But when the memorial garden ceremony happened, lighting candles for the lost, she stood with everyone else, holding space for Melissa while accepting that she couldn't bring her back, could only honor her by becoming different than the mother who'd crushed instead of cradled. Afterward, people danced, ate, laughed with the ease of people who'd survived something difficult together and come out stronger. Children played until exhaustion, parents content to let community watch while they relaxed. The trust built through months of showing up, of keeping promises, of choosing collective good over individual convenience. Lainey found herself dancing with Miguel, his hand warm on her waist, moving to music that suggested future while honoring past. Neither of them was young anymore. Both carried scars from previous loves and broken promises. But maybe that was exactly what made it work. They knew the cost of intimacy and chose it anyway. Chose vulnerability over safety. Connection over protection. When the song ended, he pulled back but kept her hand. I care about you. Want you to know that. No pressure, no expectations. Just truth. I care about you too. Lainey surprised herself with the ease of admission. I don't know what that means yet or where it goes, but I'm willing to find out. That's all I'm asking. His smile held hope and patience in equal measure. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. As midnight approached, Grace called everyone together for the ritual they'd established. Each person writing something they were releasing on biodegradable paper, floating it on the lake with small LED lights that made the water glow with collective letting go. Hundreds of wishes releasing into darkness. Hundreds of people choosing to move forward lighter. Lainey wrote, fear of not being enough. Let it float away on water that had held generations of fears and hopes. Watched her paper join others until the lake was covered in glowing releases. Beautiful and temporary and exactly right. Sophie filmed it all, capturing magic that would become story, that would inspire others to believe transformation was possible in their own communities. The documentary had already won awards, but more importantly, it had sparked conversations. Other communities reaching out, asking how they'd done it, how they'd chosen healing over harm, how they'd created space for people like Victoria to transform without sacrificing safety for people like Eleanor who'd been hurt. The answer was always the same, one choice at a time, one person willing to believe another person could change, one community deciding together that mercy and accountability could coexist, one lake held in trust, teaching everyone that true ownership was stewardship and real power was protection. As the celebration wound down, Lainey stood at the highest point of the island and looked out across water that reflected stars and lights and everything that had been built here. Her inheritance had been land and legal rights and tools for fighting. But what she'd built with it was community. Family not of blood, but of choice. Legacy not of property, but of principles worth protecting. She thought about Rose, about how her grandmother would have loved this moment. The island alive with people, the lake protected, the community thriving. All the things Rose had worked toward, but hadn't lived to see completed. But maybe that was always how legacy worked. You planted trees knowing someone else would sit in the shade. You protected things knowing someone else would inherit the protection. You loved people knowing they'd pass that love forward long after you were gone. Sophie and Ben joined her, one on each side, the three of them looking out at the life they were building together and separately. The future uncertain, but approached with courage, earned through surviving past and choosing present. This is what you wanted, isn't it, Mom? Ben's question wasn't really question, more like recognition, not the marriage or the suburban life. This, purpose and people in place that feels like home. I didn't know I wanted it until I had it. Lainey put her arms around both her children. But yes, this. Exactly this. They stood together until the last guest departed. Until the lights dimmed and the lake returned to darkness, and the island became again what it always was. Space held in trust. Sanctuary offered. Proof that people could be better than their worst moments if someone believed in their best ones. Lainey was the last to leave, paddling back to shore as dawn painted the sky. The cabin waited. Her cabin. Her lake. Her life. Not because she owned them, but because she'd claimed them. Because she'd stopped apologizing for existing and started insisting on her right to matter. Inside, she made coffee and sat on the porch watching morning happen. Another day beginning. Another chance to choose who she wanted to be. Another opportunity to honor the inheritance Rose had left, not through protection alone, but through multiplication. Taking what had been given and making it available to everyone. Teaching by example that power was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Community meeting next week about expanding the trust to include more parcels. Your grandparents weren't the only ones who bought conservation easements. Other families coming forward wanting to protect their land the same way. We could double the preserved land around the lake. The possibility expanded in Lainey's chest. Rose's vision growing beyond anything one person could have imagined. Community taking up the work, making it their own, ensuring that what mattered would be protected long after any individual was gone. She texted back, "Count me in." Another text, this one from Victoria. 6 months sober from control today. Celebrated by planting native species in the memorial garden. Melissa would have liked that. She loved getting her hands dirty. Thank you for giving me the space to remember who she actually was instead of who I tried to make her. Lainey felt tears prick her eyes. Transformation was real, happening slowly but surely. One person at a time learning they could be better than their damage if someone held space for that becoming. She set down her phone and picked up her brush. The canvas waiting was large, ambitious, probably beyond her skill level. But she was learning that growth happened at the edge of capability, in the space between what you knew you could do and what you hoped was possible. She began painting the lake, not as it was in any one moment, but as it existed across time. Summer and winter, dawn and dusk, calm water and storm-tossed waves, all the versions contained in single space, all the possibilities held in perpetual becoming. This was inheritance. Not property that could be owned, but responsibility that must be honored. Not power that controlled, but authority that protected. Not legacy that looked backward, but vision that extended forward, creating ripples that would touch shores she'd never see. Rose had known this, had left not just cabin and water rights, but example and expectation, had believed her granddaughter would rise to meet the moment when the moment arrived, had planted seeds knowing she wouldn't see the harvest, but trusting the harvest would come. And it had. Not perfectly. Not without pain or struggle or moments of doubt so profound they felt like drowning. But it had come. The community built. The transformation witnessed. The inheritance claimed and multiplied and passed forward. Lainey painted until noon, lost in the work, finding herself in the act of creation. When she finally stepped back to assess, she saw it. The lake in all its complexity, the island at its heart, the community gathered on its shores, all of it connected, interdependent, whole. She was 53 years old, single, starting over, building something from nothing. But nothing was everything. Nothing was space to become, room to grow, permission to matter. The inheritance Rose left was this: the knowledge that you didn't need to be perfect to be worthwhile, didn't need to have all answers to ask right questions, didn't need to be fearless to be brave. You just needed to show up, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of believing that transformation was possible, and then doing the work to make it real. That was legacy. That was love. That was everything that mattered. Lainey cleaned her brushes and made lunch and planned her afternoon. Would teach art class on the island at 3. Dinner with Miguel at 7. Healing Circle Thursday. Community meeting next week. The calendar full, but not burdensome. Full with purpose, with chosen obligations, with life lived intentionally instead of by accident. She was exactly where she needed to be, not because the destination was perfect, but because the journey had meaning. The lake stretched out beyond her window, holding its secrets, reflecting its truths, continuing its patient work of being exactly what it was without apology or explanation. Lainey looked at it and understood finally what Rose had tried to teach her all along. You didn't inherit land. You inherited yourself. And that was the greatest gift of all.